Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the suffocating, glittering world of medieval queenship, where your every breath is measured, your every glance decoded, and your morning routine requires more witnesses than a modern-day courtroom trial. Picture yourself waking in the canopied bed so heavy with velvet and gold thread that it could crush a small horse. The room is cold, bone-achingly cold, because it's still dark outside, hours before dawn, and you can already hear the rustle of fabric beyond your chamber door. They're waiting. They're always waiting. You blink into the darkness, and immediately a lady-in-waiting glides forward with a candle. Not just any candle, one specifically designated for the Queen's awakening, beeswax imported from distant apiaries, because tallow would be an insult to your nostrils. The flame catches, and suddenly you're aware of the other bodies in the room. 3, 4, sometimes 7 women, all standing at precise distances, all dressed in their own hierarchy of finery, all watching. You cannot yawn freely. You cannot scratch an itch on your nose without considering whether that gesture conveys weakness or humanity. The story may solve mysteries you never had an explanation for, like why being queen was less about power and more about becoming a living, breathing symbol that everyone else controlled. So, before you explore the story with me, please take a moment to help me subscribe to the channel, like and share this video, or maybe leave a comment below. But make sure you do it when you really like what I bring to you. Tell me where you're watching from tonight, or what fascinates you most about medieval history. Maybe share what time it is where you are, or simply send some kind words my way. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Now let's keep the lights as soft as possible. Turn on the fan for a gentle sound to help the story feel more emotional, and let's embark on tonight's journey together. Your feet touch the floor, not directly. Of course. A cushioned stool has been positioned exactly where your feet will land, because a queen's souls must never meet cold stone without mediation. The stool itself tells a story. It's covered in embroidered silk depicting your family's heraldry, a reminder even in this intimate moment that you represent something larger than yourself. The chief lady-in-waiting, a woman whose title roughly translates to Keeper of the Royal Body, approaches with a basin of rose water. The water has been heated to a precise temperature, tested first on someone else's wrist, and you dip your fingers in while she supports the bowl. You're not allowed to wash your own face yet. That comes later, in the 5th stage of the morning ritual, after the under-chemise has been blessed by the chaplain waiting outside. Historians still argue whether this level of ceremonial observation was about reverence or control, but the effect was undeniable. You were never alone, never unscripted, never simply yourself. Every action from the moment consciousness returned was a performance, and the audience kept score. In 12th century France, Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine reportedly had her morning ritual documented by a scribe who noted not just what happened, but the exact order and duration of each step. Why? Because a queen who deviated from established routine signalled instability. A rushed awakening meant political anxiety. A lingering under the covers suggested illness, or, worse, reluctance to rule. The dressing ceremony could take 2 hours. 2 full hours of standing while fabrics were layered, each piece handed to the next ranking attendant in a chain of privilege. The woman who held your under-chemise ranked higher than the one who held your outer kirtle, who ranked higher than the one adjusting your sleeves. You learned everyone's position not through a written chart, but by observing who touched you when, and in what order. One peculiar rule from the Burgundian court specified that the queen's left sleeve must always be fastened before her right, symbolising the sinister side being bound first, a nod to old superstitions about left-handedness and dark magic that persisted even in Christian kingdoms. And here's where it gets oddly specific. The laces on your sleeves had to be tied in a particular type of knot, not a simple bow, but an elaborate interlocking pattern that required genuine skill. If a lady-in-waiting fumbled the knot, It was considered an ill omen for the day. Some queens kept the same woman on sleeve duty for decades, terrified that a replacement might bring bad luck or, worse, incompetence that everyone would witness. Imagine the pressure on that poor woman's fingers every single morning, knowing that one trembling mistake could be interpreted as cosmic disapproval of the queen's reign. Your hair presented its own theatrical production. Unmarried princesses could wear it loose, a symbol of virginity and availability. But the moment you became queen, your hair became a secret, a private treasure that only your most intimate servants could see. It was braided, pinned, tucked under veils and wimples and sometimes elaborate horned headdresses that weighed several pounds. In England during the 14th century, one court record mentions a queen's headdress requiring 3 women to balance it properly on her head, and once positioned, she couldn't remove it for the entire day without assistance. Imagine the neck strain, the headaches, the desperate itch you couldn't scratch beneath all those pins and padding. The braiding itself followed patterns that communicated messages. A simple 3-strand braid suggested humility and piety, appropriate for religious feast days. More complex braids incorporating ribbons or gold thread signalled celebration or political confidence. If you were in mourning, your hair was braided more tightly, pulled back more severely, as if even your scalp needed to demonstrate grief. You didn't choose these styles yourself. Your chief lady decided based on the day's political climate, upcoming meetings, or recent news from neighbouring kingdoms. Your head was a billboard, and you were the last person consulted about what it advertised. And then there were the witnesses to your dressing, not just your ladies, but sometimes members of the council, visiting dignitaries, or bishops who'd been granted the privilege of observing the Queen's morning ritual. You stood there in various states of undress, though never fully naked. There were always underlayers. While men old enough to be your grandfather discussed grain taxes and border disputes. They weren't supposed to look directly at you, but peripheral vision works just fine, doesn't it? The justification was transparency. A queen who dressed in private could be concealing weapons, letters, signs of illness, or, most scandalous, evidence that she wasn't pregnant when she claimed to be. One quirky detail from the Castilian court involved shoes. You had to step into your shoes in a specific way, right foot first, always, while reciting a short prayer under your breath. The prayer wasn't just about blessing your steps, it was a test. If you forgot the words or stumbled over them, it could be interpreted as a sign that you'd spent the night engaged in activities that distracted you from your devotions. Suspicious minds were everywhere, and your morning routine was their first daily audit of your worthiness. The shoes themselves were often uncomfortably narrow, designed more for display than function, and you'd spend the entire day in varying degrees of foot pain that you could never acknowledge. Complaining about physical discomfort was considered weak, ungrateful, and deeply unqueenly. After dressing came the inspection. The chief lady would circle you slowly, checking seams, adjusting a brooch, smoothing a fold in your skirt. She was looking for imperfections, yes, but also for signs. A hem that dragged might mean you'd gained weight. A tight bodice suggested you were hiding a pregnancy. A flushed complexion could indicate fever or secret passion. You learned to control even your blood flow, to will your cheeks into neutral paleness, because your body was never just your body. It was a kingdom's fortune, a dynasty's future, a political treaty made flesh. Sometimes the inspection included a discreet check of your breath. Yes, your breath. A lady would stand close under the pretense of adjusting your collar and inhale slightly. Bad breath might suggest tooth decay, which could mean you were aging prematurely or not maintaining proper hygiene. Both political liabilities, if your breath smelled of wine from the night before. It raised questions about your evening activities. You quickly learned to chew fennel seeds or parsley before the morning ritual began. one of the few proactive measures you could take in this choreographed invasion of your person. Only after this entire production could you proceed to breakfast. But that's another theatre entirely, one with its own ruthless script. For now, you've survived the awakening. You're dressed, inspected, approved. You become the queen they need you to be. At least until tonight, when the whole exhausting process reverses itself. Sweet dreams seem like a fantasy when you realise that medieval queens often slept only 4 or 5 hours. Not because they weren't tired, but because the rituals of undressing and preparing for bed took nearly as long as the morning routine. Efficiency was never the point. The point was control, visibility, and the constant reminder that you were public property wrapped in expensive fabric. And your morning awakening was just the first act in a day-long performance that never truly ended. You move through the corridors toward the Great Hall, each step a calculated performance. And already you can smell the morning meal being prepared. Roasted meats, fresh bread, herbs crushed into butter. Your stomach might be growling, but no one will ever know because you've perfected the art of internal silence. Breakfast isn't about satisfying hunger. It's about demonstrating that you possess the self-control, grace, and political awareness befitting a monarch. The table awaits you like a stage, and every person in that hall is both audience and critic. When you enter the Great Hall, everyone rises, not casually, not slowly. They spring up as if pulled by invisible strings, and they remain standing until you've taken your seat at the high table. Your chair isn't just a chair, it's a throne-adjacent seat positioned slightly higher than everyone else's, angled so that you can see the entire room while being perpetually visible yourself. You don't rush to sit, you pause. You survey the room with a carefully neutral expression that somehow conveys both warmth and authority. And only then do you lower yourself with the exact posture you've practiced since childhood. Back straight, knees together, hands folded briefly in your lap before reaching for the table. Historians still argue whether medieval dining rules were about etiquette or social control. But the reality is they served both purposes magnificently. A queen who ate messily was considered unfit to rule. A queen who ate too eagerly suggested base instincts and lack of refinement. A queen who barely touched her food raised suspicions about pregnancy, poisoning fears, or political anxiety. You had to find the perfect middle ground, eating enough to seem healthy and content, but not so much that you appeared gluttonous or distracted from your true purpose, which was governance, not gastronomy. The first rule of royal dining: you never begin eating first. Even though you're the highest-ranking woman in the room, you wait for the king to take his first bite if he's present, if he's away at war or hunting or conducting affairs of state. You wait for the bishop or the highest-ranking noble to make the initial gesture. This isn't just courtesy, it's a poison precaution. Medieval courts lived in perpetual fear of assassination by food, and the unspoken rule was that if someone wanted to poison the queen, they'd have to poison several other important people first, making the crime more detectable and less appealing. Cheerful thought to accompany your morning porridge, isn't it? Your utensils tell their own story. By the 14th century, you might have access to a personal fork, a relatively new innovation that many still considered suspiciously foreign and possibly demonic. The fork had travelled from Byzantium through Italy, and using one marked you as sophisticated, well-travelled, or dangerously cosmopolitan, depending on who was watching. Most people still ate with their hands and a knife, so your fork usage had to be delicate, almost apologetic, as if you were demonstrating the tool rather than flaunting your superiority. The angle at which you held it mattered. Tines down suggested European refinement. Tines up looked aggressive and uncouth. Each bite required choreography. You couldn't simply shovel food into your mouth like a peasant at harvest time. Though honestly, even peasants had better table manners than you might imagine. You took small bites, chewed with your mouth closed, paused between bites to dab your lips with the linen napkin, and never, under any circumstances, reached across the table for something. If you wanted the salt cellar, you caught the eye of a servant with the subtlest glance imaginable, and they would bring it to you. Reaching suggested desperation, lack of control, insufficient staff training, all reflections on your competence as a household manager. The salt cellar itself was a political prop. In most medieval halls, it was an elaborate silver or gold vessel positioned at the centre of the high table, and where you sat in relation to it determined your social status. You, as queen, sat above the salt, closer to it than lesser nobles, and this positioning was so important that court artists included the salt cellar's placement in official banquet paintings. One peculiar custom from the French court required the queen to personally sprinkle salt on the bread of visiting dignitaries, a gesture that symbolised hospitality, protection, and, some scholars suggest, a subtle reminder that she controlled what went into their mouths. Chewing pace mattered enormously. Too fast suggested anxiety or low breeding. Too slow looked like you were showing off or didn't trust the food. You had to match the rhythm of the king's chewing if he was present, staying roughly synchronized with his jaw movements like some bizarre culinary dance. If he paused to speak, you paused. If he drank, you could take a sip, but only after he had set down his goblet, and your sip had to be noticeably smaller than his. Women who drank too heartily at breakfast were considered coarse, masculine, or potentially alcoholic, all disastrous labels for a queen trying to maintain her image as virtuous. Moderate, dignified vessel of dynastic continuity. Speaking while eating presented its own minefield. You couldn't do it, not really, but you also couldn't sit in silence like a disapproving statue. The solution was to time your conversation for the spaces between courses, those brief interludes when plates were cleared and new dishes brought out. During these moments, you were expected to engage in light, pleasant conversation that demonstrated your wit, education, and political awareness without revealing anything actually useful to potential enemies. You discussed the weather, the quality of the morning's bread, perhaps a recent tournament or a visiting scholar's lecture. You never discussed money, war strategy, your health, or anything that might be repeated and misinterpreted in other courts. Guest acknowledgement was an art form. If foreign ambassadors or visiting nobles were present, you had to acknowledge them at precisely the right moment, not so early that it seemed desperate for their approval, not so late that it seemed dismissive. The acknowledgement itself was subtle, a slight incline of your head, a brief meeting of eyes, perhaps a barely perceptible smile. One fascinating custom from the Burgundian court required queens to personally offer the first cut of meat from the morning roast to the most important guest. A ritual that took several minutes and involved the queen standing, approaching the guest section of the table, and presenting the meat on a special platter while reciting a formulaic greeting. Imagine doing this while wearing those pounds-heavy headdresses we discussed earlier, trying not to spill gravy on your silk gown. The types of food you could eat were also regulated, though the rules varied by kingdom and century. Generally, queens were expected to favour refined foods, white bread over brown, delicate fish over heavy meats, sugared fruits over common vegetables. In some courts, eating certain foods was considered unladylike. Onions and garlic gave you peasant breath. Beans caused undignified digestive consequences. Cherries stained your lips too boldly. You learned which foods were safe from both a political and practical standpoint, and you stuck to them with religious devotion, even if you secretly craved a hunk of dark rye bread slathered with butter. Waste was monitored. In an era when food scarcity affected even noble households during poor harvest years, a queen who left too much food on her plate could be accused of wastefulness, indifference to her subjects' suffering, or, strangest of all, of planning to sneak food back to her chambers for secret nighttime eating, which would suggest either pregnancy cravings or a shameful lack of self-control. Conversely, cleaning your plate too thoroughly made you look hungry, desperate, or ill-bred. You had to leave precisely the right amount of food, enough to show you were satisfied and moderate. Not so much that it looked like rejection of the cook's efforts. And throughout this entire meal, you smiled. Not a broad, genuine smile, that would be too much, but a soft, serene expression that suggested contentment, health, and inner peace. Even if you were actually thinking about the diplomatic crisis brewing with the neighbouring kingdom, or the fact that your corset is cutting off circulation to your lower body, or that one of your ladies-in-waiting has been spreading rumours about your friendship with the court poet, your face was a mask, your breakfast a performance, and the applause came in the form of respectful nods and the absence of scandalous gossip, at least gossip that reached your ears. The meal concludes, and you rise from the table with the same measured grace that seated you. But here's what no one tells you about being a medieval queen. The moment breakfast ends, an entirely different form of communication begins, one conducted not with words but with gestures so subtle they're nearly invisible, yet so powerful they can topple alliances, spark romances, or trigger diplomatic incidents. Your hands become instruments of statecraft, your eyes transform into weapons. Even the angle of your chin conveys messages you might not intend to send. You're walking through the courtyard now, heading toward the chapel for morning prayers, and already you're performing an intricate ballet of meaningful movements. A visiting duchess approaches from your left. Do you turn your full body toward her, or simply rotate your head? The difference is enormous. A full body turn suggests she's worth your complete attention, that her status matches yours, that you're willing to pause your entire schedule for her. A head turn alone, while your body continues its forward trajectory, signals polite acknowledgement without granting her equal standing. You have perhaps 2 seconds to make this calculation, and everyone watching will interpret your choice. Historians still argue whether gesture languages were consciously taught or absorbed through observation, but medieval queens certainly mastered a vocabulary of motion that rivaled spoken language in complexity. A placement of your hand over your heart meant different things depending on context. During a religious ceremony, it showed piety. During a political discussion, it emphasized sincerity. During a romantic encounter, it suggested emotional vulnerability, possibly real, possibly strategic. The same gesture, 3 entirely different meanings, and you had to execute it with the exact right pressure, duration, and accompanying facial expression, or risk sending a message you never intended. Your hands were never idle. Idle hands suggested laziness, nervousness, or, most damning, that you didn't know what to do with yourself, which implied a lack of training and breeding. Instead, your hands were always purposefully occupied, folded at your waist in a position that suggested both modesty and readiness, holding a prayer book that demonstrated devotion, or delicately adjusting a piece of jewellery in a gesture that drew attention to your wealth and status without appearing boastful. One particularly peculiar custom from the Castilian court required queens to keep their left hand slightly higher than their right when both hands were visible, a positioning that supposedly honoured the heart side of the body and demonstrated proper Christian humility. Try maintaining that posture for 16 hours a day and see how your shoulders feel. The language of rings deserves its own study. You wore multiple rings, often on every finger, and which hand you used to gesture carried specific meanings. Pointing with your ring finger on your left hand, the traditional wedding ring finger, when discussing family matters reinforced your role as wife and mother. Using your right index finger suggested authority and command. But here's where it gets deliciously complicated. Rotating a ring on your finger during conversation was a recognized signal of anxiety, boredom, or disagreement, depending on which ring you twisted and how quickly. Ambitious courtiers watched your hands like hawks, trying to decode whether that nervous ring spinning meant you were about to reject their petition or simply had an itch. Your eyes were equally treacherous tools. Direct eye contact between a queen and a social inferior could be interpreted multiple ways, as a sign of favour and intimacy, as an intimidation tactic, or as inappropriate informality that diminished your mystique. You learn to master the art of looking at someone without quite looking at them, focusing on their forehead, or their chin, or the space just past their left ear. When you did grant someone full eye contact, it became a gift, a moment of recognition so valuable that people would mention it in letters home. The Queen looked directly at me for 3 full seconds. 3 seconds of your gaze could make someone's entire year. Blinking frequency mattered. Rapid blinking suggested nervousness or deception. Too slow blinking made you seem cold, reptilian, possibly drugged. You aimed for a moderate, steady blink rate that conveyed calm confidence. Some queens practiced this in their private chambers, working with a trusted lady-in-waiting who would count blinks and provide feedback. Imagine rehearsing your own involuntary eye movements like lines in a play. One account from a French courtier describes watching Queen Marguerite of Provence practice holding her eyes open for extended periods to build endurance, resulting in tears streaming down her face. Tears she then had to learn to control, because crying in public carried its own complicated set of meanings. The positioning of your head communicated volumes. A slight tilt to the right suggested you were listening attentively and sympathetically. A tilt to the left looked calculating or skeptical. Keeping your head perfectly level and straight signalled authority and judgment. This was the posture for official pronouncements and serious political discussions. Lowering your chin slightly created an impression of modesty and submission, appropriate when dealing with the church or when your husband the king was asserting his authority. Raising your chin exposed your throat, a vulnerable gesture that paradoxically conveyed confidence. You were so secure in your power that you could afford to display vulnerability. Shoulder positioning became another element of this silent vocabulary. Squared shoulders meant you were ready for confrontation or serious business. Shoulders slightly rolled forward suggested approachability and maternal warmth, useful when dealing with children, servants, or petitioners seeking mercy. One shoulder raised higher than the other was considered sloppy and asymmetrical, suggesting inner imbalance or even moral corruption. You can imagine the back pain from maintaining perfect shoulder symmetry while wearing heavy gowns and those magnificent, torturous headdresses. Your hand's proximity to your body also signalled specific messages. Hands held close to your torso suggested self-protection, modesty, or fear. Hands extended outward implied generosity, welcome, or authority, depending on whether your palms faced up or down. Palms up was the gestures of giving and receiving, of openness and honesty. Palms down conveyed control and suppression, the calm down gesture that kings and queens used to quiet unruly crowds or end heated discussions. But you couldn't just flash these gestures randomly. They had to flow naturally from conversation and circumstance, appearing spontaneous even though they'd been calculated and rehearsed. Finger placement on objects created yet another layer of meaning. When holding a scepter during ceremonies, all 5 fingers wrapped around it suggested firm control and confidence. Holding it delicately with just 3 fingers, thumb, index, and middle, implied that power sat lightly on you, that you wielded authority without being consumed by it. When drinking from a goblet, medieval etiquette manuals specified that you should use your thumb and first 2 fingers only, never gripping the cup with your whole hand like some common tavern patron. The delicacy of your grip on everything from cups to quills to your husband's arm during public processions was constantly evaluated and interpreted. One genuinely bizarre custom involved the queenly point, an extended index finger used to indicate people. objects, or directions. The finger had to be perfectly straight, not bent at any knuckle, and the motion had to be smooth and deliberate, never jabbing or sudden. A sudden point suggested aggression or panic. A slow, graceful point conveyed thoughtful consideration and intentionality. Queens practiced this gesture until their finger could extend and hold steady for minutes at a time without trembling. Why? Because a shaking finger suggested weakness, old age, illness, or fear, any of which could be exploited by enemies. The space between your hands when they were clasped also communicated meaning. Fingers interlaced tightly suggested anxiety or intense prayer. Loosely clasped hands implied casual confidence. Hands stacked one atop the other, not intertwined, signalled formal patience, the posture for waiting through long ceremonies or tedious speeches. You cycled through these various hand configurations throughout the day, each one appropriate to specific contexts, and switching from one to another at the wrong moment could jar observers and suggest you didn't understand the social situation you were in. Even your breathing was supposed to be controlled and invisible. Heavy breathing suggested exertion, illness, or emotional distress. All weaknesses. Your corset and tight bodices helped in a perverse way. They physically prevented deep breaths, forcing you into shallow, controlled breathing that appeared calm even when you were terrified or furious. The irony was that the very garments restricting your movement also helped you maintain the appearance of supernatural composure that queenship required. Touch between people followed elaborate protocols we'll explore more deeply later, but even casual, accidental contact carried meaning. If your sleeve brushed against someone while passing in a corridor, you didn't acknowledge it, pretending it never happened, maintained social boundaries. But if you intentionally allowed your hand to rest on someone's shoulder for a moment, that was a calculated gift of intimacy. A public demonstration of favour that everyone witnessing would remember and analyse. You're approaching a doorway now, and this seemingly simple act of passing from one room to another becomes a complex negotiation of rank, precedence, and carefully calibrated motion. Who enters first? How do you position your body as you cross the threshold? Where do your feet land, and at what pace? Every element of movement through space has been codified, measured, and assigned meaning. Your body isn't just moving, it's making arguments about power, legitimacy, and divine right with every step. Walking as a queen required extensive training, often beginning in childhood. Your gait had to be measured and smooth, creating the illusion that you were gliding rather than walking. Some accounts describe young princesses practicing with books balanced on their heads. The cliché is true, but also with bells attached to their hems. If the bells chimed too frequently or too loudly, it meant your steps were uneven or too heavy. The goal was near-silent movement, a supernatural quality that separated royalty from common folk who clomped and shuffled. You were supposed to seem almost otherworldly, as if your feet barely touched the ground, as if you existed on a plane slightly elevated from ordinary physical reality. The length of your stride communicated specific messages. Short, mincing steps suggested feminine delicacy and modesty, appropriate for religious processions or formal state occasions. Longer strides implied confidence and purpose, useful when you needed to project authority or when rushing to address a crisis, though you could never actually appear to be rushing. Rushing suggested panic, loss of control, or subordination to circumstances rather than mastery over them. Even in genuine emergencies, fire, invasion, your child falling ill, you maintained that measured pace, that illusion of serene control, because the moment you ran, everyone would know that something had defeated your composure. Historians still argue whether the elaborate movement rules enhanced or constrained queenly power, but there's no question they created a visual vocabulary everyone understood. A queen who strode too purposefully into a room full of men was accused of being mannish, aggressive, or attempting to usurp masculine authority. A queen who took tiny, hesitant steps was dismissed as weak, indecisive, or overly feminine to the point of uselessness. You had to find the precise middle ground, decisive but not aggressive, graceful but not helpless, memorable but not shocking. Doorways presented special challenges. In most medieval contexts, the highest ranking person entered a room last. Not first, the logic being that everyone else should be in place, ready to receive the most important person. But queens occupied an ambiguous position, subordinate to the king but superior to virtually everyone else. So you perfected the art of the doorway pause, standing just outside the entrance while others filed in, then making your entrance at the calculated moment that maximised dramatic impact without appearing to stage manage your own arrival. Too early, and you seemed eager or anxious. Too late, and you looked like you were trying too hard to make an entrance. The threshold itself held almost magical significance in medieval thinking. It was a liminal space, a boundary between inside and outside, between one type of space and another. Some superstitions held that stumbling on a threshold brought bad luck or signalled supernatural disapproval. You learned to step over thresholds with exaggerated care, lifting your foot slightly higher than necessary, ensuring your hem didn't catch, making the crossing appear effortless, even though you were concentrating intensely on not tripping in your uncomfortable shoes. One misstep could be interpreted as an omen that your policies were misguided, or that God had withdrawn his favour. Once inside a room, positioning became the next challenge. You couldn't simply stand anywhere. Rooms had hierarchies built into their architecture. The area nearest the fire was most prestigious in winter. The space closest to windows was preferable in summer. The spot with the best view of the door allowed you to see who entered, a security and social advantage. You moved toward the appropriate position with that same measured glide, not hesitating or looking uncertain, even if you'd never been in that particular room before and had to quickly assess its social geography. Standing still presented its own requirements. Your weight had to be evenly distributed on both feet. Leaning to one side suggested tiredness, pregnancy, or injury. Knees were slightly flexed, never locked, because locked knees would cause fainting, and fainting was a disaster that would be discussed in courts across Europe for months. One arm typically rested at your side or held an object, a prayer book, a fan, a piece of embroidery, while the other might rest at your waist. Both arms hanging limply made you look like a confused peasant. Both arms akimbo suggested aggression or masculine posturing. Your feet told their own story. They had to be positioned carefully. Together suggested modesty and restraint. Slightly apart implied stability and confidence. But too far apart looked vulgar and masculine. The angle mattered too. Feet pointing straight ahead was neutral and safe. Feet turned slightly outward in the first position, borrowed from dance training, suggested refinement and courtly education. One foot slightly forward of the other created a sense of forward momentum, useful when you wanted to suggest progress or decisiveness without actually moving. Sitting presented perhaps the greatest physical challenge. You couldn't simply collapse into a chair like a tired human being. The entire process had to be choreographed. Approach the chair from the correct angle. Turn your body just so. Gather your skirts with a subtle hand motion and lower yourself in one smooth, continuous movement that engaged your core muscles and thigh strength more than you think possible while making it look absolutely effortless. Your back never touched the chair back. That would be slouching, suggesting moral laxness. You perched on the forward 2/3 of the seat, spine straight, creating that same illusion of effortless perfection that denied the physical reality of muscle fatigue and uncomfortable boning in your dress. The positioning of your legs while seated was perhaps even more fraught with meaning than standing positions. Knees had to remain together, always, creating a single vertical line from your knees to the floor. Ankles could be crossed, that was acceptable, even elegant, but crossing your legs at the knee would have been scandalous, masculine, and possibly sexually suggestive. One curious custom from the English court specified that queens should angle their crossed ankles slightly to the right, never to the left, though the reasoning behind this asymmetry has been lost to history. Perhaps it related to the same left-hand superstitions that governed sleeve fastening. Your hands while seated required constant attention. Folded in your lap was the safest option, but the fold itself had variations. Fingers interlaced suggested prayer or serious contemplation. Hands simply stacked implied patience and receptivity. Hands gripping each other could be interpreted as anxiety or self-control depending on the pressure. Resting your hands on the chair arms was acceptable only on throne-like seats during formal occasions. Doing it on an ordinary chair suggested you thought too highly of yourself, or didn't understand the difference between casual and ceremonial furniture. Rising from a seated position demanded equal grace. You couldn't push off with your hands or lean forward for momentum. Both gestures suggested weakness or age. You engaged your core and leg muscles, rising in one smooth motion that made standing up look as effortless as sitting down had appeared. The illusion of weightlessness had to be maintained at all times. Queens weren't supposed to struggle with physical reality. They transcended it through perfect training and divine favour. Or at least that's what the performance suggested. Walking through corridors involved its own set of considerations. You stayed slightly to one side, usually the right side, allowing others to pass without crowding you but also demonstrating that you understood corridor etiquette. When encountering others in narrow passages, you paused and waited for them to back up or flatten themselves against the wall, acknowledging their deference with a slight nod before continuing. But if the person approaching was higher ranking, a king, a papal legate, certain high church officials, you performed the backing up, and the skill was in making your retreat look like gracious deference rather than forced submission. Staircases were treacherous. Going up, you lifted your hem slightly, but not too much, and always with a graceful gesture that didn't reveal your ankles, and climbed at the same measured pace you used for flat ground. The temptation to hurry upstairs was strong. The expectation that you'd maintain queenly composure was stronger. Going down was worse. You had to somehow see the steps without appearing to look down, which would suggest anxiety or clumsiness. You developed a sort of peripheral vision awareness of your feet and the stair edges, trusting muscle memory and countless repetitions to keep you from tumbling down in the heap of silk and humiliation. Outdoor walking brought weather into the equation. In rain, you couldn't run for cover or appear bothered by getting wet. Ladies in waiting rushed forward with coverings, but you maintained that same glide, perhaps fractionally faster but never panicked. In mud, you somehow had to keep your hems clean while not appearing to be carefully navigating around puddles. The solution was usually a team of servants who'd laid down temporary walkways or spread fabric across muddy sections, but you still had to pretend the mud didn't exist, that your path was miraculously always clean and clear. Do you remember that morning awakening ritual from the beginning of our journey? All that careful preparation, that elaborate dressing ceremony, it was designed to create the perfect instrument for this constant physical performance. Your body had been transformed into a communication device. Every movement from your eyelids to your toes sending signals that reinforced or undermined your authority, your virtue, your worthiness to wear a crown. You're standing in the presence chamber now, surrounded by courtiers, petitioners, and visiting nobles, and the air itself seems charged with unspoken rules about who can touch whom, how, and when. Touch in a medieval court wasn't casual. It was currency, privilege, and sometimes dangerous transgression all at once. Your body existed within invisible boundaries that only certain people could cross, and those boundaries shifted depending on context, relationship, and the intricate mathematics of social hierarchy. Every hand extended toward you, every brush of fabric against fabric, carried meanings that could alter political fortunes. The most basic rule: no one touched the Queen without permission, not accidentally in a crowded corridor, not to steady you if you stumbled, not even to remove a speck of lint from your gown. Your physical person was considered semi-sacred, an extension of royal authority that common touch would contaminate or diminish. This created practical absurdities. If you tripped, people would gasp and reach toward you but stop their hands inches away, frozen by protocol, while you struggled to right yourself without assistance. The message was clear. Maintaining proper boundaries mattered more than your physical safety. But like all medieval rules, this one had elaborate exceptions and qualifications. Your ladies-in-waiting could touch you freely. They dressed you, adjusted your clothing, fixed your hair, but even their touch followed hierarchies. The chief lady could touch your face and hair. Lower-ranking attendants could only touch your outer garments and never above your shoulders. One fascinating detail from the Burgundian court specified that only women who'd borne children could adjust the Queen's bodice, supposedly because they understood female bodies and wouldn't be shocked or overly curious about what they encountered beneath the fabric. Younger unmarried ladies were restricted to handling hems and sleeves. Historians still argue whether these touch hierarchies protected queens or imprisoned them, but the effect was certainly isolating. You lived in constant physical proximity to dozens of people, yet experienced very little casual, affectionate human contact. Even embraces were codified. You might embrace a visiting princess of equal or near equal rank. But the embrace had just specific rules. You approached each other simultaneously, touched cheek to cheek on the right side first, then the left, then right again. 3 touches total, never lingering, never squeezing tight with genuine emotion. The whole interaction was performed at arm's length, bodies angled so torsos never actually pressed together, maintaining a formal distance even within the embrace itself. Kissing carried its own elaborate protocols. Not romantic kissing, that's a different category entirely, but the social kissing that greeted, honoured, or petitioned. The most common was the ring kiss, where people approaching you would kneel and kiss the ring on your extended hand. But which hand you extended mattered. Your right hand was the formal, official greeting for ambassadors and high nobles. Your left hand was offered to clergy and suggested spiritual rather than political authority. And the ring they kissed wasn't arbitrary. Different rings signalled different types of relationships. Your coronation ring for state business, your wedding ring for family matters, and sometimes a specially designated petition ring that people kissed when asking favours. The mechanics of the ring kiss revealed status with brutal clarity. High-ranking nobles might briefly touch their lips to your ring while barely bending their knees. Lower nobles performed a deeper bow and a longer kiss. Commoners granted an audience had to fully kneel, sometimes on both knees rather than one, and press their lips firmly against the ring for a count of 3. You learned to read these variations instantly, to catch the earl who didn't bow quite deeply enough, or the merchant who held the kiss too long, and to file these observations away as evidence of either disrespect or excessive ambition. Your hand, when extended for the ring kiss, couldn't just dangle limply. That would suggest weakness or reluctance. You held it at a specific angle, wrist straight, fingers relaxed but not drooping, positioned at exactly the right height for the person to reach without you having to lean down or them having to stretch uncomfortably. Too high, and you seemed arrogant, making them strain upward. Too low, and you appeared to be debasing yourself or inviting improper familiarity. The perfect height became instinctive after thousands of repetitions. Though your shoulders surely ached from holding that position through lengthy audience sessions, Touch between you and the king deserved its own manual. In public, his touch took priority. He could take your hand, place his hand on your shoulder, guide you with a hand at your elbow, all without asking permission. Your role was to accept these touches gracefully, to move in harmony with his guidance, to make his physical authority over you appear natural and welcomed rather than imposed. But here's the trick. You also had to subtly initiate appropriate touches that reinforced your partnership. Taking his arm during processions, placing your hand over his during certain ceremonies. These were your opportunities to demonstrate widely devotion and political unity. Private touch between royal spouses remains somewhat mysterious. Medieval people were obsessed with documenting public behaviour but discreet about private intimacy. What we know suggests that even in private, certain formalities persisted. You didn't casually drape yourself over the king or rumple his hair or poke him playfully. There were relaxed moments, certainly, but always within bounds of dignity appropriate to your ranks. One account describes a queen who made her husband laugh by tickling his palm during a tedious church service. But even this playfulness was described as remarkably bold and unusual, suggesting most queens maintained formal boundaries even in intimate settings. Children complicated the touch hierarchy in poignant ways. Your own children you could embrace and kiss freely when they were young, but as they aged, especially your sons, the physical affection had to diminish, become more formal, transitioning them from your babies to their roles as princes and potential kings. By adolescence, your sons received the same restrained greetings as other nobles, extended hand for a kiss, perhaps a brief touch on the shoulder, but no more maternal embracing. Daughters retained slightly more physical intimacy longer, but they too eventually transitioned to formal greetings. The message embedded in this gradual withdrawal. Royal duty superseded maternal instinct. Touching objects others would subsequently handle created another layer of complexity. When you touched a document to sign it, that document became imbued with a trace of your physical presence. People who received letters you'd personally sealed sometimes kept them as relics, believing your touch had blessed the parchment. This wasn't just superstition, it was political reality. Your touch conveyed legitimacy, authority, even a kind of magical validation. Conversely, objects you refused to touch carried implied rejection. A gift you wouldn't pick up was a gift declined. A petition you wouldn't accept into your hands was a request denied before you'd even read it. The touching of food deserves special mention. You touched your own food minimally. That's what utensils and serving pieces were for. But there were ceremonial moments when you were expected to personally handle food items, breaking bread with your own hands during certain religious observations, for instance, or personally serving the first portion of a feast's main dish to an honoured guest. These touches sanctified the food, transformed a meal into a sacramental or political event. One peculiar custom involved queens touching a loaf of bread that would then be distributed to the poor, the logic being that your touch transferred some portion of royal blessing to the recipients. Medical treatment created awkward touch situations. Physicians were male and needed to examine you, but direct touch was limited and heavily supervised. They might take your pulse, look into your eyes, smell your breath. Yes, medieval medicine was weird, but anything requiring you to disrobe or be touched intimately required female attendants as intermediaries. The physician would give instructions, and the attendants would perform the actual examination, then report back. This created a distance between your symptoms and the doctor's understanding, likely contributing to frequent medical misdiagnoses. But protecting your modesty mattered more than diagnostic accuracy. Pregnancy intensified touch restrictions and permissions simultaneously. More people needed access to your body, midwives, physicians, ladies tasked with monitoring your condition, but the touches had to be carefully choreographed and witnessed. Your expanding belly became almost public property, with noble ladies allowed to touch it for luck or blessing, especially if they themselves hoped to conceive. You couldn't refuse these touches without seeming cruel or superstitious. So you stood there while stranger after stranger placed hands on your abdomen, each one murmuring prayers or making wishes, treating your pregnant body as a kind of fertility shrine. Dancing was perhaps the most socially acceptable form of sustained touch between unrelated men and women, but even this followed strict patterns. You danced with your husband, certainly, and with high-ranking male nobles on formal occasions, but the dances themselves kept you at arm's length most of the time. Hands clasped, briefly, released, clasped again in different configurations. Full body contact was scandalous. Even hand-holding had rules, a light grip with fingers. Never a full palm-to-palm clasp that suggested excessive intimacy, and you never danced more than twice with the same partner unless he was your husband, because 3 dances implied special favour or even romantic interest. The aftermath of touch also mattered. If someone inappropriately touched you, grabbed your arm too firmly, brushed against you too closely, you couldn't recoil or show offence, that would create a scene, suggest that you were easily ruffled or that the person had genuinely violated you. Instead, you became very still, perhaps took one small step back, and allowed your ladies to subtly intervene and reposition you. The offender would hopefully realise their error from your frozen response and the sudden appearance of attendants creating a buffer. If they didn't catch on, you'd later convey your displeasure through other channels, denied audiences, cold formality at subsequent meetings, perhaps a word to your husband about certain individuals overstepping boundaries. The presence chamber falls silent as you prepare to speak, and in this moment you're acutely aware that your voice is perhaps your most versatile and dangerous tool. Not the words themselves, though those matter enormously, but the sound, the volume, the pitch, the pace, the strategic deployment of silence. Medieval queens didn't simply talk. They orchestrated auditory performances where every vocal quality conveyed layered meanings about power, femininity, authority, and divine favour. Your voice could soothe a rebellion or spark one, could seduce an ally or alienate a supporter, all depending on how you modulated its delivery. The first rule, queens spoke quietly, not timidly, not weakly, but with a controlled softness that forced listeners to lean in, to strain slightly to catch every word. This served multiple purposes. Quiet speech suggested refinement and self-control. Loud women were considered coarse, masculine, possibly hysterical. It also created intimacy and attention. When people had to concentrate to hear you, they listened more carefully, and they felt privileged to be close enough to catch your words. Your quiet voice transformed every utterance into a gift that had to be earned through proximity and attention. But quiet didn't mean monotonous. You learned to use your voice's full range within that constrained volume. A slight rise in pitch for questions or expressions of surprise, a drop to lower registers for serious pronouncements or expressions of displeasure. The modulation had to be subtle. Dramatic vocal swoops would seem theatrical or uncontrolled, but present enough to convey emotion and emphasis. One account from the French court describes Queen Blanche of Castile's voice as having variations like a gentle stream over stones, never rushing but always moving, which is perhaps the most medieval compliment to vocal technique ever recorded. Historians still argue whether vocal training was formal or learned through imitation, but evidence suggests most princesses received explicit instruction in voice control. Singing lessons, certainly, but also recitation exercises designed to strengthen breath control, expand range, and develop the ability to project without shouting. Some treatises recommend practicing with a candle. You should be able to speak clearly while holding a lit candle close to your mouth without making the flame waver. Too much breath force would extinguish it. Too little would suggest weak lungs or timidity. Pace mattered as much as volume. Speaking too quickly suggested anxiety, nervousness, or lack of thought. You were rushing because you hadn't properly considered your words or because you feared interruption. Speaking too slowly could seem condescending, as if you assumed your listeners were too simple to understand normal speech, or it might suggest you were struggling to find words, revealing ignorance or indecision. The ideal pace was measured and natural, with strategic pauses that gave your words weight and gave listeners time to absorb their significance. Those pauses were weapons in themselves. A pause before answering a question suggested you were thoughtfully considering your response, rather than blurting out an unconsidered reaction. A pause mid-sentence created dramatic tension and emphasized whatever words came next. A long pause after someone else finished speaking could convey disapproval. You were so displeased you needed time to formulate a diplomatic response. Or it could suggest the matter was so weighty it required genuine contemplation, but paused too long and you seemed confused or possibly simple-minded. So the timing had to be exquisite, calibrated to the specific social situation. Your accent and dialect carried political implications. Medieval Europe was a patchwork of linguistic variations, and how you spoke identified your origins and allegiances. If you were a foreign-born queen, you faced a delicate choice. Maintain your native accent, signalling that you hadn't abandoned your homeland and might still advocate for its interests, or adopt your new country's speech patterns, suggesting you'd fully transferred your loyalty. Most queens navigated a middle path, softening their accents over time but never entirely erasing them, demonstrating adaptability without betraying their roots. Word choice revealed education, piety, and political leanings. Sprinkling Latin phrases into your speech proved classical education and connected you to church authority. Using fashionable French terms, French being the language of courtly culture across much of medieval Europe, demonstrated sophistication and cosmopolitan awareness. But overusing foreign words or Latin could make you seem pretentious or out of touch with your subjects. You needed to code switch fluently, adjusting your vocabulary to your audience. More learned language with scholars and clergy, simpler phrasing with petitioners and servants. Though never so simple that it seemed you were dumbing things down, laughter presented its own minefield. You couldn't guffaw, snort, or cackle. Those were peasant laughs, uncontrolled and therefore unsuitable for royalty. The queenly laugh was a light, musical sound, barely more than an extended exhalation with a slight melodic quality. It expressed amusement without suggesting you'd lost composure or found something so hilarious it had conquered your dignity. Some etiquette guides actually specified that queens should practice laughing in private. Developing a laugh that sounded genuine yet remained controlled, a nearly impossible combination that nonetheless you were expected to master. Crying was even more fraught. Queens could cry, but only in specific contexts with specific types of tears. Religious tears during prayer or contemplation of Christ's suffering were acceptable, even admirable. They proved piety and emotional depth. Tears at funerals were expected, though even grief tears had to be measured, not the wild sobbing that common women indulged in. But tears of frustration, anger, or self-pity were absolutely forbidden. Those suggested weakness, inability to handle the burdens of queenship, or emotional instability that enemies could exploit. You learned to cry decorously when appropriate and to suppress tears entirely when they arose from any emotion besides religious devotion or properly channeled grief. The command to silence others was perhaps your most powerful vocal tool. You didn't shout silence like some tavern keeper calling for order. Instead, you employed a sharp intake of breath, a slight raising of one hand, or simply began speaking in that carefully cultivated quiet voice that somehow cut through noise and chatter. The room would fall silent not because you'd overpowered the noise, but because everyone strained to hear what you were saying, and that required them to shut up immediately. This technique only worked if you'd already established your authority and if you used it sparingly, deploy it too often and it lost its magic. Giving orders required careful vocal calibration. Direct commands could sound harsh, masculine, potentially offensive to male nobles who disliked taking orders from women. So you learn to phrase commands as requests or questions. Perhaps it would be wise to send messengers north, instead of send messengers north. The interrogative form preserved everyone's dignity. They could respond as if they were agreeing with your insight rather than obeying your command, while still ensuring your will was enacted. But occasionally, when dealing with clear subordinates or in genuine crises, you needed to give direct orders in a firm, unquestioning tone that brooked no debate. Knowing when to use which approach was the art that separated effective queens from figureheads. Gossip posed unique challenges. You couldn't appear to gossip, that was beneath royal dignity, but you needed to know what everyone was saying, which required sources, which required conversations that looked suspiciously like gossip. The solution was to listen rather than speak. You'd create opportunities for others to talk, asking seemingly innocent questions, making observations that invited elaboration, while contributing minimal information yourself. Your voice became a tool for extraction rather than distribution, drawing out secrets while revealing nothing. And when you did need to plant information or spread a particular narrative, you whispered it to carefully selected ladies-in-waiting who would then accidentally let it slip in contexts where it would circulate naturally. Prayers posed interesting vocal challenges because they existed at the intersection of performance and genuine devotion, or at least the appearance of genuine devotion. Your prayer voice needed to sound sincere and humble without seeming weak or overly theatrical. You spoke loudly enough for others to hear your piety. Private prayer performed publicly, one of medieval Christianity's many paradoxes, but not so loudly that it seemed performative. The words had to flow smoothly, suggesting the prayers were deeply familiar, embedded in your heart and mind, not being read cold from a prayer book even when they were, "Do you remember how your morning awakening was attended by witnesses? How breakfast was theatre? How every gesture carried meaning?" Your voice operates in that same heightened reality, where nothing is casual and everything communicates multiple messages simultaneously. By now your throat probably aches from the constant tension of maintaining perfect vocal control. Your jaw is tight from never fully relaxing into natural speech patterns. But you dare not let the strain show. Dare not clear your throat too often, or cough without covering your mouth in that precise, graceful way that suggests a delicate constitution rather than the beginning of a cold. A servant approaches carrying a velvet cushion, and resting upon it is a gift from a visiting ambassador, perhaps a jewelled casket, or an illuminated manuscript, or a bolt of rare silk from distant lands. This moment, seemingly simple, is actually a diplomatic minefield where your every reaction will be analysed, reported back to foreign courts, and potentially shape international relations for years to come. Gift-giving and receiving in medieval courts wasn't about generosity or gratitude. It was a complex language of obligation, status, and political messaging where accepting the wrong gift could bind you to unwanted alliances, and rejecting one could trigger wars. You can't simply reach out and take the gift. First, you must assess it from a distance, allowing your gaze to rest on it long enough to show interest, but not so long that you appear covetous or materialistic. Your facial expression during this initial viewing is crucial. Too much enthusiasm suggests desperation, or that the gift's value exceeds what you're accustomed to receiving, implying your own court is less wealthy than you'd like others to believe. Too little reaction insults the giver, suggesting their offering is beneath your notice or inadequate to your station. You aim for what one etiquette manual calls pleased acknowledgement with reserved dignity. Essentially, you look happy but not surprised that someone would give you something valuable, because of course you deserve valuable things. The next calculation involves whether to accept the gift at all. Some presents came with strings attached so obvious they might as well have been wrapped around the box. A particularly lavish gift from a foreign king might be interpreted as an attempt to purchase your influence over your husband's foreign policy decisions. Accepting it could suggest you were open to such influence, or even that you'd been bought. But refusing it could insult the giver and damage delicate diplomatic relations. The solution often involved accepting the gift with carefully worded thanks that emphasized it as a gesture of friendship between kingdoms rather than a personal present to you, subtly repositioning it as a state matter rather than a personal transaction. Historians still argue whether medieval queens had genuine autonomy in gift acceptance or whether their choices were predetermined by advisors, but the performance still fell to you. You had to execute the acceptance or refusal with grace that made the decision seem natural and spontaneous, rather than the result of lengthy council meetings about geopolitical implications. One fascinating account from the Aragonese court describes a queen who developed a reputation for losing gifts she didn't want to keep. They'd be accepted during the public ceremony, then would mysteriously disappear into her household's inventory, never to be worn or displayed, effectively neutralizing their political message without the overt insult of refusal. The manner of accepting a gift followed rigid protocols. You didn't grab it yourself. That would be grasping and undignified. Instead, you made a small gesture, perhaps extending one hand palm up or simply inclining your head slightly, and a lady-in-waiting would retrieve the gift from the presenting servant and bring it to you. Then you might touch it briefly, examining it with apparent interest, making comments that praised the gift without committing to anything. How exquisite the craftsmanship, rather than, I shall treasure this always. Because the first statement is neutral fact while the second creates obligation. Your thank you had to be calibrated precisely to the gift's value and the giver's rank. Too effusive and you seemed obsequious or overly impressed. Too brief and you appeared ungrateful. For gifts from social equals or near equals, you expressed thanks that emphasized the thoughtfulness rather than the material value. Your kindness in remembering our conversation about such matters touches us deeply. For gifts from inferiors seeking favour, you acknowledged receipt without suggesting the gift had purchased anything. Your loyalty and devotion are noted and appreciated. The phrasing created hierarchical distance while still being technically grateful. Timing of the thank you also mattered. Immediate verbal thanks during the presentation ceremony? Certainly. But then follow-up communication was expected, except when it wasn't. Gifts between royal equals often required a formal letter of thanks sent within a specific time frame, usually a week to 10 days. Too quick and it seemed you'd been impatiently waiting. Too slow suggested you'd forgotten or didn't care. But gifts from subjects to their queen didn't always require written acknowledgement beyond the verbal thanks at presentation. Sending a letter could seem like you were treating them as equals or that you felt defensive about accepting their gift. The display or use of gifts carried its own messages. Wearing or using a gift during subsequent meetings with the giver demonstrated favour and appreciation. But wearing it too often, especially if it was distinctive jewellery or clothing, suggested either that you had limited wardrobe options, implying poverty, or that the giver had purchased special influence over you. The strategy was selective display. Wear or use the gift occasionally, particularly during encounters with the giver or their representatives. But intersperse it with other items to maintain the appearance of having abundant choices. Some gifts were designed to test you. A book written in a language you supposedly knew. Could you read it? Or had you exaggerated your education? A religious relic that had to be venerated properly. Did you know the specific saint's story and the appropriate prayers? A hunting bird that required skilled handling? Could you demonstrate the aristocratic competency you claimed? These test gifts required you to respond knowledgeably without making it obvious you knew you were being tested. One delightful story from the English court involves a queen who received a supposedly rare gemstone that was actually coloured glass. She examined it with apparent appreciation, made knowledgeable comments about gemstones in general without specifically authenticating this one, and then quietly had it incorporated into a lesser piece of jewellery, where its dubious authenticity wouldn't matter much. Giving gifts as queen involved equal complexity. You couldn't give gifts that exceeded your recipient's status, that would embarrass them or create uncomfortable obligation. But gifts too modest insulted their importance or suggested you were stingy or poor. You needed intelligence networks to understand what gifts people wanted, needed, or would find meaningful without being presumptuous. One peculiar custom involved queens keeping detailed lists of gifts given and received, tracking not just what was exchanged but how recipients reacted, creating a database of social obligations and relationships that informed future gift decisions. The gifts you gave had to reflect well on your judgment and taste. Commissioning a beautiful illuminated prayer book for a pious noble demonstrated that you understood their character and values. But if that noble later fell from favour or was exposed as less pious than they appeared, your gift choice looked naive or politically tone-deaf. You were essentially making public bets on people's characters and positions, and wrong bets damaged your reputation for insight and judgment. Religious gifts occupied special territory. Relics, prayer books, devotional art. These couldn't be refused without seeming impious, but they also came with expectations. If you received a relic, you were expected to house it appropriately. Perhaps build a reliquary, certainly venerate it publicly. This could become expensive and time-consuming, effectively making the gift a burden disguised as a blessing. But you smiled, accepted graciously, and added commission reliquary to your endless list of queenly obligations. Gift exchanges with other queens were particularly fraught, because you as direct status competitors. The gifts had to be perfectly matched in value and significance. Too generous made you seem insecure or showing off. Too modest suggested you didn't consider the other queen your equal. Often these exchanges were negotiated in advance through intermediaries to ensure rough equivalence. But the public presentation still had to seem spontaneous and heartfelt. You might be giving your rival a jewelled brooch while privately hoping she chokes on her dinner. But publicly you were dear sisters in queenship exchanging tokens of mutual affection. Rejecting gifts required maximum diplomacy. You couldn't just say no thank you. That was unthinkably rude. Instead, you employed elaborate fictions. Such a treasure deserves a setting more worthy than our humble court. Or, we cannot in good conscience accept such generosity when we have nothing of equivalent value to offer in return. These face-saving formulas allowed the giver to withdraw the gift without direct rejection. Though everyone understood the subtext, sometimes rejection was itself a gift. You were sparing the giver from creating an obligation they might not be able to sustain. Anniversary and birthday gifts to you were virtually mandatory for certain classes of nobles and required advanced planning on their part. They had to bring something, but they also had to bring something different from what everyone else brought, and somehow know what you'd appreciate without having the presumption to ask your preferences directly. This created an industry of court informants and lady-in-waiting consultations where nobles try to gather intelligence about your current interests, needs, and desires. Your preferences became valuable information, and you could manipulate this by expressing interest in certain things. Knowing gifts of that type would follow. The gifts you gave to your own children communicated parenting philosophy and political strategy simultaneously. Lavish gifts suggested you were raising them to expect luxury and might be spoiling them. Modest gifts could seem cold or suggest you were preparing them for hardship. Educational gifts like books or musical instruments advertised your commitment to their development. Martial gifts like child-sized armour or weapons emphasized preparation for their future roles. Every toy, every piece of clothing, every small treasure you gave your children was analysed by observers as evidence of your priorities and values as both mother and queen. You're seated at your writing desk now, and before you lies parchment, ink, quills, and wax, the tools of written communication that in medieval courts were almost as powerful as armies. Every letter you write, every document you sign, every scrap of correspondence leaving your chambers carries messages far beyond its written words. The quality of the parchment, the colour of the ink, the style of your script, the temperature of the wax seal, all of these elements communicate status, urgency, intimacy, and political positioning before a single word is read. Your correspondence isn't just communication, it's a carefully choreographed performance executed on paper. The parchment itself speaks volumes. The finest vellum, made from calf skin or even uterine vellum from stillborn calves, was reserved for the most important correspondence, letters to other monarchs, official proclamations, documents meant to last generations. Using such expensive materials for routine communications would seem wasteful or desperately status-conscious. But using cheaper parchment for important letters suggested poverty or disrespect. You maintained different grades of writing materials and had to instantly assess which level each correspondence deserved. One wrong choice and you'd either insulted the recipient or advertised your court's financial struggles. The greeting formula followed complex rules that varied by recipient and relationship. Letters to your husband began with elaborate titles and expressions of wifely submission. To my most honoured lord and husband, by the grace of God, King of... Even if privately you argued with him constantly and wielded significant power, letters to other queens required careful calibration. Too formal and you seemed cold or competitive. Too casual and you appeared presumptuous about your relationship. The perfect greeting suggested warm collegiality while maintaining appropriate dignity. Something like, to our most dear sister in queenship, greetings with sincere affection and respect. Historians still argue whether queens actually composed their own letters or dictated to scribes who polished the language. But evidence suggests most literate queens wrote personal correspondence themselves while using scribes for official documents. The difference was visible in the handwriting. Your personal letters showed your actual script, with all its individual quirks and variations, while official documents displayed the uniform, professional hand of trained scribes. This distinction mattered because a letter in your own handwriting suggested intimacy and personal investment, while a scribed letter maintained formal distance. Your handwriting itself communicated character and education. Too elaborate and decorative suggested vanity or excessive time spent on frivolous pursuits. Too plain bordered on masculine or suggested inadequate education in the feminine arts of beautiful writing. The ideal was what period manuals called elegant clarity, letter forms that were beautiful without being ostentatious, readable without being pedestrian. You'd practiced this handwriting since childhood, filling practice sheets until the letters flowed automatically, until your hand produced consistent, recognizable script even when you were tired, angry, or distracted. Ink color carried meaning beyond aesthetics. Standard black or brown ink was suitable for most correspondence. But special occasions or recipients might warrant coloured inks. Red ink suggested urgency or royal authority. It was sometimes reserved for the signatures of monarchs. Blue ink occasionally appeared in letters to clergy, honouring the Virgin Mary's traditional colour, but using coloured inks casually made you seem frivolous or trying too hard to be distinctive. One peculiar custom involved adding gold flakes to ink for letters to papal legates, transforming the written words into something approaching sacred art. Though this was expensive enough that most queens saved it for only the most crucial communications. The content of your letters had to navigate between genuine communication and performative correspondence, because you always assumed your letters might be read by unintended audiences. Messengers could be intercepted, letters copied before delivery, or recipients might share your correspondence with others, either deliberately or through careless storage. So you wrote in layers, surface meanings that seemed innocuous if intercepted, and subtler implications that your intended recipient would understand based on shared context or prearranged code phrases. Becoming fluent in this multi-layered writing took years of practice and countless mistakes that taught you which phrases could be misinterpreted. Expressing emotion in letters required delicate balance. Too much passion or sentiment seemed unqueenly, overly feminine, possibly unstable. Too little made you appear cold or inhuman. You threaded the needle by using conventional emotion phrases that suggested feeling without revealing genuine vulnerability. It grieves us to learn of your troubles rather than I am devastated by your suffering. The plural first person, the royal we, created distance even within expressions of care, protecting you from seeming too personally invested or affected by others' fortunes. The closing of letters followed formulas as rigid as the openings. For equals, you might write given under our hand and seal or in friendship and royal regard. For subordinates, the closing asserted your authority, by our command and under our seal. For superiors, primarily church officials, since few people ranked above a queen, you closed with humility, with due reverence and obedience. But even these formulas had variations that conveyed subtle gradations of relationship and mood. Adding given in haste suggested urgency without panic. Including a specific date emphasized the letter's importance as a historical record. Your signature was perhaps the most analyzed element. It had to be consistent yet distinctive, recognizable as uniquely yours but difficult to forge. Most queens developed elaborate signatures that incorporated flourishes, sometimes including small symbols or decorative elements that would be nearly impossible for forgers to replicate perfectly. Your signature wasn't just your name, it was a legal and mystical representation of your person, binding you to the document's contents as surely as if you'd spoken the words aloud in a public ceremony. You practiced your signature until you could execute it identically every time, because inconsistency raised questions about a document's authenticity. The seal was the final and perhaps most crucial element, your personal seal, typically set in a ring or stored in a secure box, bore your coat of arms or a personal device. The wax colour mattered. Red was most formal and official. Green sometimes indicated joy or celebration. Black signalled mourning or serious matters. But most importantly, how you applied the seal communicated trust and authority. You personally held the seal and pressed it into the hot wax yourself for the most important documents. Your physical act creating the authentication. For routine correspondence, a trusted servant might apply your seal under your supervision, but you remained in the room, witnessing and authorizing the act. The wax temperature and pressure required surprising skill. Too hot and the seal would blur or damage the parchment. Too cool and it wouldn't take a clear impression. Too much pressure crushed the design. Too little left it faint and questionable. You learned to judge wax temperature by how it pooled and flowed, and you developed the muscle memory to press with exactly the right force for exactly the right duration. A perfect seal impression demonstrated competence and attention to detail. A messy one suggested carelessness, or possibly that the document had been sealed in haste, under duress, or even that it was a forgery where someone unfamiliar with your sealing technique had attempted to replicate it. Secret correspondence presented unique challenges. You couldn't use obvious codes or ciphers without advertising that you had something to hide, but you also couldn't write plainly about sensitive matters. The solution was often to embed crucial information in seemingly innocent details. The roses in the garden have bloomed early this year might mean, our military preparations are ahead of schedule. You and your trusted correspondents developed these personal languages over time. vocabularies of innocuous phrases that carried hidden meanings based on shared understanding. Letter storage and destruction were as important as letter writing. You kept copies of important outgoing correspondence and filed incoming letters in organized systems that allowed you to reference previous exchanges. But some letters had to be destroyed immediately after reading, burning them in your fireplace while witnesses confirm the destruction. The decision about which letters to keep and which to burn was itself strategic. Keeping a letter meant you might need to reference it later, or that it protected you by documenting someone else's promises or positions. Destroying it meant the content was too dangerous to preserve, or that you wanted no record of having received certain information. Responding to letters required timing calculations. Immediate responses to urgent matters showed competence and concern, but immediate responses to routine correspondence suggested you had nothing better to do or were overly eager for this correspondence approval. Strategic delays conveyed that you were busy with more important matters, or that you were carefully considering your response. The trick was matching response timing to the letter's importance and the relationship with its sender, a calculation that required understanding both epistolary etiquette and political strategy. Do you remember those gift-giving protocols we explored, where everything carried multiple meanings? Letter writing operates in the same heightened symbolic realm, where ink and paper become battlegrounds for status, power, and influence. Your fingers are probably cramping from holding the quill correctly, not gripped like a modern pen but held more delicately, allowing the wrist to move gracefully while maintaining consistent pressure. Your eyes ache from reading and writing in candlelight that flickers and dims unpredictably, but the letters must be written, the correspondence maintained, because a queen who failed to communicate effectively was a queen who lost control of her narrative and her influence. The chapel bells toll, calling you to prayer, and you set aside your correspondence to join the procession of courtiers heading toward the sacred space where your piety will be performed and judged. Religious observance for a medieval queen wasn't about personal spirituality, though you might genuinely possess that too. It was about demonstrating the divine approval that legitimized your rule. Every moment in church became theatre where your kneeling technique, prayer posture, and hymn participation proved to witnesses that God had chosen you for queenship and continued to bless your reign. Faith was mandatory, but the performance of faith was even more crucial. You enter the chapel, and immediately the choreography begins. Where you kneel matters enormously. Not just any cushion will do. Your designated spot is marked, often with embroidered cushions bearing your coat of arms, positioned at the optimal location, close enough to the altar to demonstrate devotion and importance, but not so close that you intrude on the clergy's sacred space. The positioning also ensures maximum visibility. Courtiers behind you can observe your posture and devotion, while you can see the altar and participating clergy. You're simultaneously worshipper and spectacle, praying to God while being watched by everyone else. The descent to kneeling was as choreographed as any other movement you'd make. You couldn't simply drop to your knees like a common penitent overcome with religious fervour. Instead, you lowered yourself with controlled grace, gathering your skirts with one hand, using the other hand to steady yourself against a pew or lady-in-waiting's extended arm, then sinking down in one fluid motion that somehow appeared both humble and dignified. Your knees touched the cushion simultaneously. A lopsided landing suggested clumsiness or physical weakness, and immediately you assumed proper prayer posture. Historians still argue whether the elaborate religious protocols enhanced genuine spirituality or reduced it to hollow performance. But for you in this moment, the distinction hardly matters. Your hands fold in the specific configuration appropriate for your rank, fingers interlaced, hands positioned at chest level, not pressed flat palm to palm like a child's prayer hands, but with a small space between the palms, creating a sort of triangle that pointed upward toward heaven. This hand position had to be maintained throughout extended prayers, and if your hands started to fall forward or apart from fatigue, it suggested waning devotion or physical frailty. Your head inclined forward at approximately 30 degrees, enough to show reverence, but not so much that your elaborate headdress unbalanced, or your chin disappeared into your chest. You'd practice finding this exact angle using reflective surfaces and patient attendants who'd tell you when you'd achieved the proper position. Your eyes were partially closed, not squeezed shut, but lowered and unfocused, supposedly directing your inner vision towards spiritual contemplation. But your eyelids couldn't droop too much or you'd appear to be falling asleep, which had actually happened to more than one exhausted queen during lengthy services, causing scandals that echoed through courts for years. The duration of your kneeling communicated devotion's intensity. During standard prayers, you knelt for their duration, then rose when appropriate. But for special occasions, religious feast days, times of crisis, requests for divine intervention in illness or war, you engaged in extended kneeling that pushed your physical limits. An hour on your knees demonstrated serious devotion. 2 hours bordered on saintly. 3 or more hours ventured into territory that might seem excessive or attention-seeking, unless you were genuinely praying for something critically important. Your knees ached, sometimes bled through your stockings onto the cushions, evidence of suffering for faith that some queens deliberately allowed to be witnessed and reported. Praying aloud added another performance layer. Your voice during prayer adopted a particular quality, slightly more musical than normal speech, with extended vowels and careful articulation that made every word of Latin or vernacular prayer clearly audible to nearby observers. You had to sound sincere without being theatrical, devout without being fanatical, loud enough to be heard but not so loud that you seemed to be showing off your piety. The balance was exhausting to maintain, especially during prayers you'd recited thousands of times and had to somehow infuse with fresh-seeming devotion. Responding to liturgical calls and responses required perfect timing. When the priest intoned his portion, you waited exactly the right interval before responding, not jumping in too quickly, which seemed eager or irreverent, but not leaving a gap so long that it appeared you'd forgotten your line. Your response had to match the priest's volume and tone, creating a sense of harmonious dialogue between divine representative and royal supplicant. If your timing or tone was off, it disrupted the service's sacred rhythm and reflected poorly on your religious education and attentiveness. Hymn singing presented unique challenges because it required you to balance several competing demands simultaneously. You needed to sing loudly enough to be heard, demonstrating full participation and setting an example for other worshippers, but not so loudly that you drowned out others or seemed to be performing rather than worshipping. Your singing voice had to be pleasant and reasonably on key. A queen with a terrible singing voice couldn't simply refrain from singing without seeming impious, but singing badly made services uncomfortable for everyone and raised questions about your broader competencies. The lyrics themselves sometimes posed problems. You had to know them perfectly. Fumbling words during hymns suggested inadequate religious instruction or inattention during services. But certain hymns contained lines that could be interpreted as politically relevant if you emphasized them a particular way. A hymn about God overthrowing the mighty might be sung neutrally as theology, or could be inflected to sound like a veiled threat against rivals. You had to navigate these potential interpretations, singing with devotion that couldn't be misconstrued as political commentary unless you specifically wanted to send a message, in which case subtle emphasis on certain phrases could communicate plenty. Physical stillness during long services tested your endurance dramatically. You couldn't fidget, scratch itches, or shift your weight too obviously. Your body had to remain in prayer posture with minimal movement, creating an impression of being so absorbed in spiritual contemplation that physical discomfort didn't register. This required genuine physical conditioning. Your core muscles, your back, your knees all had to be strong enough to maintain positions for extended periods. Some queens engaged in private exercises specifically to build the stamina needed for public worship, though discussing such practical preparations would shatter the illusion that your perfect prayer posture came naturally from pure devotion. Receiving communion was perhaps the most scrutinized moment of any religious service. You approached the altar with downcast eyes, hands folded, moving with slow deliberation that suggested unworthiness approaching the sacred. Kneeling at the altar rail, you tilted your head back slightly to receive the consecrated bread, mouth open just enough for the priest to place it on your tongue without your lips touching his fingers. That would be inappropriate contact. You closed your mouth carefully, allowing the host to rest on your tongue briefly before swallowing. The whole process executed with reverence that bordered on the theatrical, because everyone was watching to ensure you treated the Eucharist with proper respect. The wine presented additional complexity. You couldn't gulp it greedily, but you also had to take a genuine sip substantial enough to be seen consuming Christ's blood. The chalice rim touched your lips, one of the few moments when an object touched by many others would touch your mouth, and you sipped carefully, avoiding any action that might be interpreted as reluctance or excessive enthusiasm. After sipping, you maintained your kneeling position for several seconds of continued prayer before rising and returning to your place. The walk back performed with the same measured grace as your approach. Weeping during services was acceptable, even admirable, if it appeared spontaneous and spiritually motivated. Tears during particularly moving sermons, or during the consecration of the Eucharist, or while venerating relics demonstrated that you were spiritually sensitive, capable of being moved by divine presence. But the tears had to seem genuine. Theatrical crying would be transparent and disgraceful, and they couldn't be so excessive that they became disruptive or suggested emotional instability. A few decorously shed tears, perhaps dabbed away with a small cloth, proved your spiritual depth without crossing into unseemly display. Your behaviour toward relics required special attention. When a relic was displayed, a saint's bone, a piece of the true cross, a vial of holy blood, you approached it with a specific combination of eagerness and reverence. Too eager and you seemed superstitious or desperately seeking miracles. Too reserved suggested doubts about the relic's authenticity or power. You knelt before it, perhaps reached out to touch its reliquary with fingertips that trembled slightly, not from genuine emotion necessarily, but from the performance of emotion, and spent an appropriate amount of time in its presence. Too brief a veneration insulted the saint. Too long held up the service and made you seem attention-seeking. Private prayer in your chambers operated under different rules since fewer people witnessed it, but you still couldn't entirely relax because your ladies-in-waiting were present, and they talked. You maintained at least some of the formal prayer postures and rituals, though perhaps for shorter durations, ensuring that reports of your private devotions would confirm your public piety. Some queens kept prayer schedules so rigorous that they bordered on monastic discipline, rising for midnight prayers, maintaining multiple daily prayer sessions, creating reputations for exceptional holiness that provided political armour against criticism. Do you remember how your morning awakening was witnessed and judged? Your religious observances exist in that same fishbowl, where every gesture of faith is analysed for authenticity, adequacy, and appropriateness. Your knees are throbbing now from time spent on hard cushions despite their embroidered softness. Your back aches from maintaining perfect posture through another lengthy service. But you rise from your prayers with serene expression intact, because showing the physical cost of devotion would make you seem weak, would suggest that serving God was a burden rather than a privilege. and a queen who couldn't bear the weight of public piety certainly couldn't bear the weight of a crown. The most private moments of your life are about to become painfully public. Because conceiving, carrying, and delivering royal children isn't a personal experience, it's a state matter requiring documentation. Witnesses and performances that would make the most extroverted person crave solitude. Your body, always semi-public property, transforms during pregnancy into something even more collective, a vessel for dynastic continuity that everyone from scullery maids to foreign ambassadors has opinions about. The moment whispers begin that you might be carrying an heir, the scrutiny intensifies from merely oppressive to absolutely suffocating. Conception itself, while physically private, existed within frameworks of public accountability. Your marital bed wasn't just furniture, it was a stage where the dynasty's future was created. And sometimes that stage had literal audiences. During the bedding ceremony following royal weddings, witnesses, bishops, nobles, sometimes dozens of people, accompanied the newly married couple to their chamber, watched them get into bed together, and sometimes remained nearby to confirm through sounds or morning after inspection that consummation had occurred. This wasn't prurient curiosity, it was legal necessity. An unconsummated marriage could be annulled, so proof of consummation protected dynastic stability. Even after the wedding night, your bedroom activities remained subjects of court speculation and discussion. If you weren't pregnant within a reasonable time frame, usually a year or two, questions arose about whose fault it was, whether the marriage was being properly conducted, whether either party was infertile or cursed. Your monthly cycles were tracked by ladies-in-waiting who monitored when you bled, how heavily, how regularly. This information, theoretically private, circulated among the court's inner circles, with people calculating your fertile days and noting whether the king visited your chambers at optimal times. Historians still argue whether medieval people understood conception mechanics as well as we do, but they certainly grasped the basics and developed elaborate theories about optimizing fertility. You might be advised to eat certain foods, avoid others, sleep in specific positions, pray to particular saints known for aiding conception. These recommendations came from physicians, midwives, older female relatives, and random courtiers who felt entitled to share their theories about your reproductive functions. You smiled, thanked them for their concern, and tried not to scream at the constant invasion of what should have been intimate privacy. The first signs of pregnancy, missed bleeding, morning sickness, breast tenderness, became instant news, though you were supposed to maintain modest uncertainty until several months had passed. Announcing too early risked public embarrassment if you miscarried, which happened frequently and carried assumptions of divine judgment or moral failing. So you endured those early nauseated weeks, while your ladies exchanged knowing glances and everyone waited for you to make it official. The moment you did announce pregnancy, everything changed. Suddenly, every action was scrutinized for its potential impact on the baby. What you ate, how you moved, what you looked at. Yes, medieval pregnancy beliefs included the theory that what mothers saw could mark their unborn children. Your wardrobe shifted to accommodate your expanding body, but the changes had to happen gradually and modestly. Appearing in obviously maternity clothing too early suggested you were flaunting your condition or too focused on physical comfort rather than maintaining queenly dignity. The garments themselves became more voluminous, with clever draping that emphasized your fertility without seeming immodest. Your pregnant body was supposed to be both visible, proof of your successful performance of wifely duty, and demurely concealed, a paradox you navigated through expensive fabrics and skilled seamstresses. Movement during pregnancy required recalibrating all those carefully practiced walking and standing techniques. Your balance shifted as your belly grew, but you couldn't waddle or struggle visibly. You adjusted your gait to remain smooth and gliding despite the weight distribution changes. perhaps accepting a supporting arm from a lady-in-waiting when negotiating stairs, but always making it appear that you are granting them the privilege of assisting rather than desperately needing support. Falls during pregnancy were catastrophic, both for obvious medical reasons and because they suggested carelessness, or even divine disapproval of your condition. Medical examinations during pregnancy involved multiple practitioners, all male except for midwives, examining you through layers of mediation. Physicians asked questions answered by your ladies. They observed your appearance from across the room. They might take your pulse or examine your urine. Yes, urine inspection was a major diagnostic tool, but direct examination of your pregnant belly was conducted by midwives who then reported to the physicians. This elaborate modesty dance supposedly protected your dignity while actually just interposed additional people between you and useful medical care. As your due date approached, you entered confinement, a period lasting roughly a month when you withdrew from public life into a darkened chamber prepared specifically for childbirth. The confinement chamber was sealed against drafts, hung with tapestries, deliberately darkened because medieval medical theory held that too much light endangered labouring women and newborns. You entered this dim, increasingly stuffy space accompanied by your female attendants and midwives, leaving behind the world of men and politics for a liminal space that was part sick room, part sacred chamber, part prison. The wait for labour to begin, trapped in that darkened room, must have been psychologically excruciating. You couldn't leave for fresh air or entertainment. You prayed, you did needlework, you talked with your women, and you tried not to think about the very real possibility that you might die in the coming ordeal. Maternal mortality was high. Perhaps 1 in 3 women died in childbirth or from subsequent complications, and queens weren't exempt. You'd seen other women enter confinement and never emerge. You'd attended funerals for women who'd survived the birth only to succumb to childbed fever days later. But you couldn't show fear. That would be unseemly and might be interpreted as lack of faith in God's plan. When labour began, the room filled with additional people, midwives, experienced noblewomen, sometimes physicians hovering outside the chamber, occasionally clergy preparing to baptize a potentially dying infant. Your labour was attended by a crowd. The noise alone must have been overwhelming. Women offering encouragement, giving instructions, praying aloud, discussing your progress as if you weren't the person most intimately involved in the process. You couldn't scream too loudly. Excessive noise suggested lack of control, but you also had to make sounds that confirmed you were genuinely labouring, not faking or exaggerating. Your position during labour followed traditions that varied by region and era. Sometimes you laboured on a birthing stool designed specifically for the purpose, sometimes on a bed, sometimes supported between 2 strong women while you squatted. Wherever and however you laboured, witnesses observed everything, their presence necessary to confirm that the child born was truly yours, that no substitution occurred, that the baby emerged from your body and no one else's. This prevented fraud. A queen desperate for an heir might theoretically try to claim another woman's child as her own, but it also meant you had zero privacy during the most vulnerable, painful, and undignified experience of your life. The actual birth moment brought even more scrutiny. As the baby crowned and emerged, people pressed closer to see, to confirm the baby's sex, to check for any abnormalities, to verify that this was a live birth. If you delivered a son, jubilation erupted immediately. Bells rang, messengers were dispatched, celebrations began while you lay there bleeding and exhausted. If you delivered a daughter, the response was more muted. Polite congratulations masking disappointment that you hadn't produced the critically needed male heir. And if you delivered a stillborn child or one who died quickly, grief mixed with suspicion about what you'd done wrong to deserve such divine punishment. The placenta's delivery was also witnessed and examined. Medieval medicine believed the afterbirth could reveal information about the pregnancy, the child's health, even whether you'd been faithful to your husband, completely nonsensical theories, but ones that meant even your placenta was subjected to analysis and discussion. It was disposed of with ceremony in some traditions, buried in specific locations, or burned with prayers, ensuring that even biological waste from royal bodies received more attention than most people's actual bodies received. Recovery from childbirth should have been restful, but instead became another performance. You remained in confinement for weeks after delivery, supposedly regaining strength, but actually waiting for the churching ceremony that would ritually purify you and allow you to re-enter public life. During this recovery period, you received visitors, high-ranking nobles coming to congratulate you and see the baby, which meant you had to be presentable and gracious despite postpartum bleeding, exhaustion, and possibly infections. You reclined decorously on fresh linens, looking as healthy and serene as possible, while inside you might be feverish, in pain, or terrified that the complications you were experiencing would kill you. The churching ceremony that ended your confinement was itself elaborate theatre, dressed in white, looking as virginal as possible despite having just given birth. You processed to the church accompanied by attendants, knelt for prayers of purification and thanksgiving, and received the priest's blessing that theoretically cleansed you of the pollution that childbirth had imposed on your body. The ceremony's theology was problematic. It suggested childbirth was contaminating, that performing your primary duty as queen had somehow dirtied you, but it was mandatory, and you performed it with appropriate gratitude and humility. And then, after all this, the conception scrutiny, the pregnancy monitoring, the witness labour, the recovery performance, you were expected to do it again. And again, queens who produced only 1 or 2 children were considered to have failed at a primary responsibility. So you endured this entire process multiple times, each pregnancy carrying the same risks, the same invasions of privacy, the same reduction of your personhood to your reproductive function. Your body became a battlefield where dynastic wars were won or lost, and you were simultaneously the territory, the soldier, and somehow expected to be the general maintaining strategic composure throughout. The bells tolled differently today, slowly, heavily, their mournful rhythm announcing that death has visited the court. Perhaps the king has died, or a royal child, or a parent or sibling whose loss reshapes the political landscape. Your grief, whatever its genuine depth, must now be performed according to scripts so detailed they govern how many tears you shed, which garments you wear, and even how you arrange your facial muscles during the months of mandatory mourning. Death for medieval queens wasn't a private sorrow to be processed quietly. It was a public spectacle where your every gesture of grief would be analysed as evidence of your character, your loyalty, and your political positioning. The moment death occurs, or more accurately, the moment you're officially informed of it. Because you're never present at actual deathbeds unless they're your own children's, you must produce an immediate reaction. Too much visible shock suggests you weren't prepared or weren't maintaining proper awareness of the person's declining condition. Too little surprise implies you expected or even desired the death. The ideal response is controlled dismay, a sharp intake of breath, perhaps a hand rising to your heart, a brief closing of your eyes as you absorb the news, followed by immediate composed adjustment to your new reality. You're allowed perhaps 10 seconds of visible emotional reaction before you must begin performing official grief. Your first act is usually to retire to your chambers, accompanied by your ladies, where you're supposed to give vent to private sorrow. But even this privacy is relative. Your attendants are present, and they'll later describe your reaction to others. So you can't completely abandon composure. You might weep, but decorously. You might pray aloud, calling on God and the saints. You might even collapse briefly onto your bed. but not in a way that seems theatrical or suggests you're unable to cope with the realities of life and death. Your grief has to seem genuine but not incapacitating, deep but not destabilizing. Historians still argue whether medieval mourning rituals provided genuine emotional support or simply added burden to grief. But for you in this moment, the distinction hardly matters. You have perhaps an hour, maybe two, before you must emerge and begin the elaborate performance of official mourning that will consume weeks or months of your life. First comes the wardrobe change. Your colourful gowns are stripped away and replaced with mourning garments that vary by era and region, but universally signal grief through colour and coverage. Black is the standard mourning colour, though in some times and places white was used for widows or for mourning children. Your mourning clothes cover you more completely than your usual garments. Higher necklines, longer sleeves, veils that obscure your face and hair. The fabrics might be fine. You're still a queen, after all, but they lack ornamentation. No jewels except perhaps a simple cross, no embroidery, no bright trims. You're supposed to look like grief has stripped away vanity and worldly concerns, leaving only sorrowful piety. The effect is usually that you look dramatically pale and somewhat ghostly, which actually serves the performance by making you appear genuinely affected by loss. The veil deserves special attention because it becomes your most important costume piece during mourning. Heavy, dark, sometimes multiple layers. The mourning veil literally comes between you and the world, allowing you to hide facial expressions while still being visible as a grief-stricken figure. You can weep behind it without your tears being too clearly visible. You can compose your features without seeming cold. You can even rest your face in ways that would be impossible if everyone could see you clearly. The veil is simultaneously burden and protection, symbol and tool. Your movements during mourning become even more restricted than usual. You glide more slowly, as if weighted down by sorrow. Your gestures are smaller, more contained, suggesting that grief has diminished your presence and vitality. You speak more quietly. If at all, extended periods of near silence are acceptable during mourning, interpreted as being too overcome with grief for casual conversation. This has the practical advantage of meaning you don't have to maintain witty court banter when you're genuinely exhausted by loss and ritual. The funeral itself is the culmination of early mourning, and your role in it follows precise choreography. You process behind the coffin at exactly the right distance, close enough to show connection, not so close that you seem to be clinging desperately. Your pace matches the funeral drums or bells, creating a rhythmic quality to your movement that's almost hypnotic. You don't look at the crowds who've gathered to watch the procession. Your eyes remain downcast or fixed on the coffin ahead, suggesting you're too absorbed in grief to notice worldly spectators. At the grave or tomb, you perform what might be your most scrutinized moment, the farewell. This might involve placing a symbolic object on the coffin, a flower, a piece of jewellery, a prayer book, and the object you choose communicates volumes about your relationship with the deceased. Too expensive and you seem to be showing off. Too cheap suggests you didn't value them highly. The gesture itself must be slow and deliberate, your hand perhaps trembling slightly as you release the object, demonstrating reluctance to let go but ultimate acceptance of divine will. Your weeping at the funeral has to hit precise notes. Visible tears are expected. Their absence would be shocking and suggest either callousness or suspicious relief at the death. But you can't wail or collapse dramatically, which would seem uncontrolled and possibly manipulative. Instead, you produce what might be called noble tears. They flow down your cheeks, perhaps accompanied by slight shaking of your shoulders, but you remain upright and aware. Grief-stricken but not destroyed, it's an incredibly difficult performance to sustain, requiring you to genuinely access sad emotions while simultaneously controlling how you express them. After the funeral, mourning continues for a prescribed period that varies by your relationship to the deceased. For a husband, you might mourn for a year or longer. For a child, several months at minimum. For more distant relatives, a few weeks of formal mourning followed by a gradual return to normal dress and activities. During the full mourning period, you withdraw from most public entertainments. No dancing, no elaborate feasts, no bright colours, no jewellery beyond the simplest pieces. Your life becomes a constant demonstration of how the loss has diminished your joy and worldly engagement. But here's where it gets politically complicated. While you're expected to mourn visibly, you also can't let mourning interfere with essential queenly duties. You still attend council meetings, still manage your household, still participate in governance, so you have to calibrate your grief to be visible but not debilitating, present but not all-consuming. This creates strange contrasts where you might be discussing grain supplies or diplomatic negotiations while dressed in full mourning black. Tears drying on your cheeks, embodying simultaneous sorrow and competence. The length of your mourning also communicates messages about the deceased's importance and your relationship with them. Mourning too briefly suggests you didn't value them or are eager to move past their death for suspicious reasons. Mourning too long, especially for a husband when you're young enough to remarry, can seem excessive, possibly performative, or suggest you're not ready to fulfill your continued dynastic duties by forming a new alliance through remarriage. You have to time your gradual return to normal life perfectly, watching for social cues about when it's acceptable to lighten your mourning dress, when to attend your first entertainment, when to smile in public again without being accused of insufficient grief. One particularly cruel custom involved prohibiting mourning queens from attending celebrations or happy occasions, even ones important to court life. If an heir was born to another noble family, if a military victory was celebrated, if a religious feast day called for festivities, you remained in your mourning quarters, excluded from joy by grief's requirements. This isolation could last months, and during it you lost political visibility and influence, becoming somewhat ghostly yourself, present in the court but removed from its active life. A shadowy figure everyone knew was there, but no one directly engaged with. The gradual shedding of mourning followed its own protocol. You didn't suddenly appear one day in bright colours announcing that grief had ended. Instead, you transitioned through stages, from full black to black with subtle grey or purple accents, then to muted colours, and finally back to your normal wardrobe. Each stage was noted and discussed. Too fast a progression drew criticism, too slow made people impatient with your extended sorrow. You had to feel your way through the transition, gauging court opinion and finding the acceptable pace for returning to life. Do you remember how your voice was a tool of power, how your gestures spoke volumes? In mourning, you're learning an entirely different vocabulary, the language of loss, sorrow, and gradual healing, all performed for audiences who judge whether your grief meets their expectations. Your mourning veil is damp now from real tears mixed with performative ones, and you've almost forgotten which is which. Your black gowns feel like they've become your permanent uniform, and part of you wonders if you'll ever wear colours again. Ever laugh without first checking whether enough time has passed to make laughter acceptable. But the requirements are clear, and you'll follow them. Because a queen who mourns incorrectly is a queen who's failed at yet another aspect of an impossible job. The mourning period has finally lightened enough that you're permitted to attend entertainments again. And tonight there's a feast with musicians, acrobats, and dancing. You should feel relief at this return to normalcy, but instead you feel the familiar weight of performance settling over you like that heavy, mourning veil you've recently shed. Entertainment for medieval queens wasn't recreation. It was another arena where your reactions, participation, and boundaries would be monitored, analysed, and judged. Your laughter had to sound genuine but not excessive, your enjoyment visible but not undignified, and every moment of leisure was actually work dressed up as pleasure. You enter the great hall where the feast is already underway. and immediately you must calibrate your expression to reflect pleased anticipation without seeming overly eager for frivolity. The transition from mourning to entertainment is delicate. Appear too happy and people will say you've forgotten the deceased. Remain too sombre and you seem to be rejecting the court's attempt to restore normalcy and joy. You settle on what you hope reads as gentle pleasure, a soft smile that suggests you're ready to find happiness again without having abandoned grief entirely. It's exhausting. This constant calculation of appropriate emotional display. Music fills the hall, and your response to it is immediately scrutinized. You can't ignore the musicians. That would insult both them and whoever arranged the entertainment. But you also can't appear too absorbed in the music, swaying or tapping along, because that would seem unqueenly, too physically responsive to sensory pleasure. Instead, you listen with attentive stillness, perhaps nodding slightly when a particularly skillful passage occurs, your face reflecting appreciation in a way that honours the musician's craft without suggesting you're transported beyond proper self-control. Historians still argue whether medieval nobles genuinely enjoyed their entertainments or merely endured them as social obligations. But for you, the question is almost meaningless. Enjoyment and obligation are so thoroughly intertwined that separating them is impossible. You might genuinely love music, but you can never simply lose yourself in it. You might find a jester's jokes hilarious, but your laughter must remain measured. Every entertainment experience is filtered through the lens of appropriateness, and spontaneous joy becomes yet another thing you've sacrificed to queenship. Laughter is perhaps the most dangerous response entertainment can provoke from you. We've touched on queenly laughter before, that controlled musical sound that barely qualifies as laughter at all, but in entertainment contexts. The temptation to laugh more freely is intense. A genuinely funny performance might make you want to throw your head back and roar with delight, but doing so would be catastrophic. Instead, you produce that practiced light laugh, perhaps covering your mouth delicately with your hand, eyes crinkling with amusement but never squeezing shut with hilarity. You're allowed to show you found something funny, but not that anything could overcome your composure enough to make you laugh, like a common person enjoying a joke. The types of entertainment you're exposed to have been carefully selected to be appropriate for your presence. No vulgar songs with sexual innuendo, no bawdy tales that might make you uncomfortable, no performances that mock nobility or question divine right. What you see has been sanitized, pre-approved, rendered safe for royal consumption, but occasionally something slightly inappropriate slips through. A joke with a double meaning, a song lyric that's more suggestive than intended, and in those moments your response becomes critical. If you laugh or seem to understand the inappropriate element, you appear less innocent and pure than a queen should be. If you look confused, you seem naive or simple. The solution is usually to maintain a neutral, pleasant expression and act as if you caught only the innocent surface meaning. Dancing presents entertainment's most interactive challenge. As a queen, you're expected to dance on appropriate occasions, but dancing itself is fraught with rules about partners, proximity, and the types of dances you can perform. Slow, stately dances like the pavan are safest. They involve minimal touching, lots of space between partners, and movements that emphasize grace over exuberance. Faster dances with more physical contact or energetic movement are riskier. They could make you appear too physical, too enthusiastic, possibly even sexually provocative if you're not extremely careful. Your dancing partners are predetermined by rank and relationship. You dance with the king first, always. If he's present and able, then perhaps with high-ranking nobles in order of precedence, or with visiting dignitaries as diplomatic courtesy. You never dance with anyone significantly below your rank. That would be inappropriate familiarity, and you never dance with the same partner multiple times unless it's your husband. because repeated dances suggest special favour or attraction. The politics of partner selection are so complex that usually your ladies or advisors work out the dancing schedule in advance, ensuring you won't accidentally insult someone by dancing with their rival or create scandal by appearing to prefer certain company. The dancing itself requires you to look effortless while executing complex steps in heavy gowns and uncomfortable shoes. You must maintain perfect posture, move gracefully through the patterns, and make it appear that you're thoroughly enjoying yourself without showing any sign of exertion. If you're breathing hard, sweating, or showing fatigue, it suggests poor physical conditioning or that you're trying too hard. Queens are supposed to glide through dances as effortlessly as they glide through everything else, making physical effort invisible beneath layers of practiced grace. Your facial expression while dancing follows its own rules. You maintain pleasant engagement with your partner, making brief eye contact, offering slight smiles, appearing to enjoy their company, but never so much engagement that onlookers might interpret it as romantic or special interest. The expression has to be warmly neutral, friendly without being intimate, engaged without being absorbed, and you must maintain this precise emotional balance while also concentrating on your footwork, the music's rhythm, and not tripping over your own skirts or your partner's feet. When not actively participating in entertainment, your attention and reaction to others' participation is monitored. If nobles are dancing, you watch with apparent interest and approval, perhaps commenting favourably on particularly graceful performances. If musicians or entertainers are performing, you give them your attention without seeming so riveted that you've forgotten your queenly dignity. If someone makes a mistake, a dancer stumbles, a musician hits a wrong note, you pretend not to notice, maintaining the fiction that everything is proceeding perfectly. Drawing attention to errors would embarrass the performer and make you seem unkind or excessively critical. Games and contests at court require your participation in carefully limited ways. You might be asked to judge a poetry competition, which means evaluating submissions diplomatically so you praise all entrants while selecting a winner who happens to be the politically appropriate choice. You might present prizes for tournaments or archery contests, which involves standing for long periods looking gracious, while armed men compete violently or show off their skills. These aren't really entertainment for you. They're opportunities for you to serve as decorative authority figure, blessing the proceedings with your presence and making winners feel specially honoured by receiving awards from royal hands. Board games and card games in more intimate settings present different challenges. You can play, but you can't be too competitive or too skillful. Winning too often makes others uncomfortable. But deliberately losing too obviously is insulting and transparent. You aim for a middling performance that shows you understand the games and enjoy playing without dominating or seeming to try too hard. One peculiar custom involved queens sometimes playing with weighted dice or marked cards that gave them slight disadvantages, ensuring they wouldn't win too frequently and make other players feel bad about beating royalty. Conversation during entertainments is itself a form of performance, requiring you to be witty but not sharp, engaging but not monopolizing, intelligent but not intimidating. You tell amusing stories about things you've seen or heard, but never gossip maliciously about specific people. You ask questions that draw others out and make them feel interesting, but you don't interrogate or seem overly curious about matters that don't concern you. You're simultaneously the most important person in the room and somehow responsible for making everyone else feel important and entertained. Ending your participation in entertainment requires as much choreography as beginning it. You can't simply announce you're tired and leave. That would be abrupt and suggest the entertainment wasn't sufficiently engaging. Instead, you wait for an appropriate lull, perhaps the end of a musical set or between dance rounds, and make gracious departure noises about needing to attend to other duties or observe religious hours. You thank the hosts and entertainers with specific compliments that show you are paying attention. You bid good evening to the assembled company with appropriate warmth, and you process out with the same measured grace that brought you in, maintaining queenly dignity until you're finally behind closed doors. But even then, back in your chambers, the entertainment isn't quite over because your ladies want to discuss what happened. Who wore what? Who danced with whom? Which performances were particularly good or bad? You are expected to participate in this debriefing, offering opinions that are fair and measured, never too harsh or too effusive. These conversations will be repeated and spread through the court, so every comment you make becomes part of the larger narrative about your tastes, your fairness, your character. Even your private responses to entertainment become public knowledge eventually, and you can never fully drop the performance. Do you remember those touch hierarchies? The language of gesture, the constant visibility? Entertainment simply adds another layer to that same suffocating surveillance, where even joy and leisure must be carefully portioned and presented. Your feet ache from dancing in those ridiculous shoes. Your face hurts from maintaining pleasant expressions for hours, and you're fairly certain you missed most of the actual entertainment because you were so focused on reacting to it correctly. But tomorrow there might be another feast, another performance, another opportunity to demonstrate that you're a queen who appreciates beauty and culture while never forgetting the dignity and control that your position demands. And you'll do it all again because the alternative, refusing to participate, would be seen as even more problematic than the exhaustion of performing pleasure. The morning arrives with news that you'll be travelling, not a casual journey, but an official procession from one castle to another, perhaps 20 or 30 miles away. And what should be a simple change of location becomes instead a meticulously choreographed spectacle that will take days to complete. Travel for medieval queens wasn't about efficiently getting from point A to point B. It was about transforming movement through space into political theatre where every town you passed through, every bridge you crossed, every moment of visibility became an opportunity to display royal power, wealth, and divine favour. The journey's logistics are staggering, but the performance requirements are what truly exhaust you. Preparation begins days in advance, with advance riders sent ahead to notify towns and nobles along your route that the Queen's procession will be passing through. This isn't courtesy, it's giving them time to prepare appropriate receptions, to clean their streets, to gather crowds who will witness your passage, to arrange whatever ceremonies local custom demands when royalty enters their territory. You can't simply ride through unannounced. That would be bizarre and possibly threatening, as if you were skulking rather than proudly displaying your royal presence. Your travel must be heralded, anticipated, and met with the deference that proves your subjects acknowledge your authority. Your travelling wardrobe requires an entire cart of its own, because you'll need multiple outfit changes during the journey. You can't arrive at your destination wearing the same dusty clothes you departed in. That would suggest poverty or insufficient attention to appearance. So you pack gowns for travelling, gowns for arriving, gowns for various ceremonies and meals along the route, gowns for sleeping in at whatever noble houses will host you overnight, plus all the accessories, undergarments, and maintenance supplies needed to keep you looking impeccably royal throughout. The sheer volume of fabric and associated items is almost comical, requiring servants whose sole job is managing your wardrobe's transportation and care. Historians still argue whether these elaborate travel ceremonies enhanced royal authority or simply wasted resources. But for you about to embark on this journey, the question is academic. The procession is assembling in the courtyard, and you must position yourself correctly within it. You don't lead the procession. That would be your husband's position if he were travelling with you, or the highest-ranking male noble or church official in his absence. But you're not buried in the middle either. You occupy a position of honour, visibility, and protection, forward enough to be clearly important, surrounded by guards and attendants who signal your value and vulnerability simultaneously. Your conveyance matters enormously. Sometimes you ride a horse, a beautiful, well-trained mount with expensive trappings that match your gown, but only when the weather is good and the route suitable for displaying your riding skills. More often, especially for longer journeys, you travel in a litter or covered carriage that protects you from weather and road dust, while still allowing you to be seen through curtains that can be opened or closed as circumstances require. The vehicle itself is decorated with your coat of arms, painted in bright colours, hung with fabric and possibly bells that announce your approach before you're even visible, inside your conveyance. You can't simply slump and nap, even though travelling is exhausting and often quite uncomfortable over medieval roads. You maintain upright posture, ready at any moment to be visible through the curtains, because you never know when you'll pass through a town or encounter people along the road who expect to see you. Your ladies travel with you, and even in this semi-private space you're maintaining queenly composure, perhaps doing embroidery or reading devotional texts, demonstrating that even in transit you're engaged in appropriate queenly activities rather than just enduring transportation. The pace of royal processions is maddeningly slow. You travel perhaps 10 or 15 miles per day when you could probably cover 3 times that distance if speed was the priority. But speed isn't the priority. Visibility is. You move slowly enough that people lining the road can really see you, can take in your fine clothing and the magnificence of your entourage, can feel they've had a genuine encounter with royalty. The slow pace also allows for frequent stops, to receive local officials, to accept gifts from towns you pass through, to bless children presented for your touch, to allow your entire travelling household to rest and refresh. Entering towns and cities requires specific ceremonies that vary by location, but share common elements. You usually pause outside the gates while local leaders approach to offer formal welcome, often presenting symbolic keys or other tokens of the town's submission to royal authority. You accept these with gracious words prepared in advance, praising the town's loyalty and perhaps mentioning something specific about its history or industry that shows you've been briefed and consider them worthy of your attention. Then you process through the streets, moving even more slowly than usual so crowds can see you, while musicians play and people cheer, or are required to cheer, which amounts to the same thing from your perspective. These urban processionals reveal class stratification with brutal clarity. The finest citizens are positioned closest to your route, dressed in their best, selected for visibility. Poorer residents are kept back or relegated to less visible positions. Children are often brought forward because they're considered innocently loyal, unlikely to pose threats, and their presence makes the whole scene more appealing and wholesome. You wave to them, that same measured, graceful wave where your hand moves from the wrist, never the whole arm, and try not to think too hard about how many of these cheering subjects live in desperate poverty while you travel past wearing a gown that costs more than their family will earn in a lifetime. Overnight stops at noble houses along your route present their own challenges. Your hosts have been preparing for weeks, cleaning obsessively, arranging the finest chamber for your use, planning meals that will impress without seeming to try too hard. When you arrive, they greet you with elaborate ceremony, and you must respond with warmth that honours their hospitality, without suggesting you're so impressed that your own accommodations must be inferior. You inspect what they've prepared, the chamber, the bed, the amenities, and offer compliments that are specific enough to seem genuine but never so effusive that you appear surprised by basic quality. Dining at these stopover locations requires all those table manners and eating performances we explored earlier, but with the added complexity that you're eating someone else's food in someone else's hall, and every aspect of the meal is being designed to impress you. The hosts watch anxiously to see which dishes you favour, how much you eat, whether you seem pleased. You have to eat enough to show appreciation, but not so much that you seem gluttonous or unconcerned about digesting heavy food before continuing your journey. You compliment specific dishes, ask about ingredients or preparation, make conversation that puts your hosts at ease while maintaining the dignity gap that reminds everyone you're still their queen. Sleeping in unfamiliar beds presents practical and symbolic challenges. The bed has been specially prepared, often with new linens, and you're supposed to sleep in it to honour your host's efforts. But you also have to worry about bed bugs, fleas, or simply that the mattress and pillows are different from what you're accustomed to, and you won't sleep well. Your ladies inspect everything, sometimes bringing your own linens to layer over the provided ones, trying to create enough familiarity that you might actually rest. But often you lie awake in these strange rooms, listening to unfamiliar sounds, aware that tomorrow brings another day of slow travel and public performance. And rest seems like yet another thing you're supposed to achieve perfectly, but can rarely manage. Weather complications can derail carefully planned processions, but you can't simply cancel or dramatically alter plans without good reason. If rain threatens, your ladies scramble to protect your clothing and you proceed anyway. Perhaps closing your litter's curtains but continuing to move forward, because stopping suggests weakness or that you're too delicate for minor discomfort. If roads become muddy and impassable, you wait with apparent patience while servants work to create paths or find alternative routes, never complaining, never showing frustration, maintaining serene confidence that solutions will be found because of course the world will rearrange itself to accommodate your passage. Arrival at your destination is the procession's culmination and requires your most polished performance. You've been travelling for days. You're exhausted. You desperately want a bath and your own bed. But you must enter the city or castle with energy and enthusiasm that suggests the journey was effortless and you're delighted to have arrived. If there are crowds, you wave and smile. If there are ceremonies, you participate with full attention. If there are speeches of welcome, you listen as if each word fascinates you and respond with thanks that honour the speakers. Only after all public obligations are satisfied can you finally retreat to private chambers and drop the performance, sinking into exhaustion that no one beyond your intimate attendants will ever know about. Do you remember how movement through doorways required calculation? How every gesture spoke? Travel compounds all those requirements, adding miles of visibility, days of sustained performance, and the complexity of moving your entire theatrical production across landscapes where everything is less controlled than in your home court. Your body aches from maintaining posture in a swaying litter. Your face hurts from smiling at thousands of faces, and you've almost forgotten what it feels like to move without being watched. But the journey has political value, has reminded distant subjects that their queen exists and cares enough to be seen, has demonstrated wealth and power to anyone who might consider challenging royal authority. So you'll rest briefly, and then tomorrow or next week there might be another journey, another procession, another opportunity to transform travel into theatre. And you'll do it again because being queen means being perpetually on display, even when you're supposedly just getting from one place to another. The arrival of foreign ambassadors brings news that tensions between neighbouring kingdoms are escalating, and suddenly you're not just performing queenship, you're actively engaged in preventing war through the carefully calibrated dance of diplomatic conflict resolution. This is perhaps your most delicate role, where a single wrong word, an inappropriate gesture, or a misread social signal could mean the difference between peace and bloodshed. Medieval queens weren't supposed to engage directly in military matters, but they were absolutely expected to be diplomatic instruments. Using all those performance skills you've developed to soothe wounded pride, facilitate compromises, and create face-saving solutions that allowed powerful men to back down from conflicts without appearing weak. You're summoned to a council meeting where the dispute is being discussed, and immediately you must assess the situation's emotional temperature. Who looks angry? Who seems frightened? Who appears calculating and ready to exploit the crisis? You position yourself, usually seated slightly apart from the main discussion but clearly present and attentive, and you watch. Sometimes, your most powerful diplomatic tool is strategic silence, allowing men to argue themselves toward exhaustion while you wait for the moment when your intervention will be most effective. Speaking too early means your words get lost in the chaos. Speaking too late suggests you're not engaged or don't understand the urgency. When you do speak, your voice becomes a tool for de-escalation. You don't shout to be heard over arguments. Instead, you speak in that carefully cultivated quiet tone that forces others to silence themselves to hear you. The effect is almost magical. Suddenly the room quiets, and all attention turns to you. Your words must be carefully chosen to address the conflict without seeming to take sides prematurely. Perhaps you ask clarifying questions that expose the dispute's actual origins beneath the posturing and accusations. Perhaps you'll remind everyone of shared interests or past successful collaborations. Perhaps you simply request that everyone take a moment to breathe and pray before continuing, invoking religious obligation to force a cooling-off period. Historians still argue whether medieval queens had genuine diplomatic power or merely provided decorative cover for decisions men had already made. But the evidence suggests that skilled queens wielded considerable influence through these informal channels. You couldn't command armies or officially declare war, but you could write letters to other queens urging them to influence their husbands toward peace. You could arrange marriages between rival families' children, creating kinship ties that made warfare more complicated and less appealing. You could offer to host negotiations in your chambers, creating space for private conversations where men could explore compromises without publicly backing down. One of your most effective techniques is the strategic deployment of hospitality and gift-giving. Remember those complex protocols we explored earlier? When tensions run high, you might invite the rival parties to a feast in your chambers, creating an environment where they're your guests, and therefore bound by hospitality rules that forbid violence or excessive hostility. The meal becomes a negotiation space where the rituals of eating together, sharing food, drinking from the same vessels, create symbolic bonds that make conflict seem less acceptable. You orchestrate seating arrangements that put rivals next to allies who can whisper moderation, and you guide conversation toward neutral or nostalgic topics that remind everyone of better times. Gift exchanges become diplomatic tools in your hands. You send carefully chosen presents to offended parties, not bribes exactly, but gestures that acknowledge their grievances and demonstrate respect. A beautifully illuminated manuscript about just governance for a noble who feels he's been treated unfairly. A relic of a warrior saint for a commander being asked to stand down from military mobilization. A piece of jewellery for another queen with a letter asking her to use her influence for peace. These gifts create obligation and soften hearts, making recipients more receptive to compromise because they don't want to seem ungrateful or unreasonable after accepting your generosity. Your ability to move between different social spaces gives you diplomatic advantages that men in more rigid roles lack. You can visit with other women, wives, mothers, daughters of the men in conflict, and through these conversations plant seeds of peace. A worried wife might urge her husband to consider compromise. A mother might remind her son that honour isn't worth orphaning his children. You facilitate these conversations without seeming to conspire. Perhaps mentioning casually during a needlework session how tragic it would be if conflict escalated. Letting the other women draw their own conclusions and take their own actions. Letter writing becomes crucial during diplomatic crises, and you employ all those correspondence protocols while also encoding subtle messages. You might write to a rival queen in language that seems purely social, discussing children, health, religious observances, while actually negotiating terms. Our son has been practicing his swordsmanship less lately, and spending more time with his books might really mean we're not preparing for military action. The roses in our garden are blooming beautifully this year, could signal conditions here are peaceful, and we wish to maintain that. You and your correspondent both understand these codes, built through years of exchange, creating a parallel diplomatic channel that operates beneath official negotiations. Face-saving becomes your specialty because you understand that pride and honour often matter more to medieval nobles than practical concerns. You develop elaborate fictions that allow both sides to claim victory, or at least avoid humiliation. Perhaps the dispute was all a misunderstanding caused by a rogue subordinate who's now been punished. Perhaps both sides were actually correct from certain perspectives and can agree to disagree on minor points while collaborating on major ones. Perhaps God has sent signs, a vision, a miraculous event, an omen you somewhat creatively interpret, suggesting that peace is divinely preferred. These face-saving narratives require creativity and the ability to sell them convincingly, making everyone believe they have achieved something rather than simply back down. Mediation sessions in your chambers follow careful choreography. You position yourself between the disputing parties, literally and symbolically. You control who speaks when, preventing the conversations from devolving into shouting matches. You ask each side to state their grievances and their desired outcomes, forcing them to articulate concrete demands rather than vague accusations. You identify areas of potential agreement, highlighting them enthusiastically while downplaying remaining differences. You suggest compromises that you've carefully crafted in advance, presented as if they just occurred to you in the moment, making both sides feel like they're participating in creative problem-solving rather than accepting dictated terms. Your emotional intelligence becomes a diplomatic weapon. You read body language, vocal tone, and facial expressions to understand what people really want beneath their stated positions. Perhaps the aggressive noble doesn't actually want war, but needs to feel his honour has been defended. Perhaps the insulted bishop cares less about the specific grievance than about being shown proper respect going forward. You address these underlying emotional needs through symbolic gestures, a public apology phrased to satisfy honour without admitting real wrongdoing, a ceremony that demonstrates respect without conceding power, a private meeting that makes someone feel heard even if their demands aren't fully met. Sometimes you deploy what might be called strategic emotionality, using displays of feminine distress to influence negotiations. You might allow tears to fall while describing how conflict would affect innocent subjects, making the men feel protective and noble for considering peace. You might express fear about how your children would suffer if their fathers went to war, activating paternal instincts. This is delicate work because excessive emotionality would seem manipulative or weak, but carefully calibrated displays of feeling can be extraordinarily effective in softening hardened positions. You're using gender expectations as tools, performing femininity strategically to achieve diplomatic ends. Your religious role provides another avenue for conflict resolution. You can call for prayer sessions, invoke divine will, suggest that God wants peace and that continuing conflict would be sinful. You can arrange for clergy to preach sermons about forgiveness and reconciliation, coordinate religious ceremonies that require rivals to participate together in worship, or even suggest pilgrimages that will remove angry parties from the immediate situation and give them time to cool down. Medieval people took religious obligations seriously, and you leverage that piety toward peaceful outcomes. Negotiating marriage alliances is perhaps your most permanent conflict resolution tool. If two families are feuding, arranging a marriage between their children creates kinship ties that make continued hostility more complicated. You identify appropriate matches, approach families diplomatically about the possibility. Negotiate terms that satisfy both sides' honour and practical interests. These negotiations require months or years of careful work, evaluating potential matches, managing expectations, creating agreement frameworks that address concerns about dowries, inheritance, and household arrangements. But a successful marriage alliance can end feuds that have persisted for generations, and you get credit for the peacemaking. Your networks of information become crucial during conflicts. You maintain relationships with ladies-in-waiting in other courts, with merchants who travel between kingdoms, with clergy who hear confessions and gossip. Through these sources, you learn what's really happening, who's actually preparing for war versus who's just posturing, which nobles are wavering in their support for conflict, where financial or logistical problems might make military action difficult. This intelligence lets you intervene strategically, perhaps approaching a noble whose support is crucial but whose commitment is shaky, offering incentives for choosing peace. Failure in diplomatic conflict resolution carries serious consequences. If negotiations collapse and war begins, you might be blamed for insufficient effort or poor judgment. Men might die, territory might be lost, your own family could be endangered, all because you couldn't craft a solution that satisfied competing interests. The pressure is enormous, and unlike military commanders who have clear metrics of success or failure, your diplomatic work operates in shades of grey where partial successes might be the best possible outcomes. You celebrate compromises that prevent worst-case scenarios while knowing that no one is completely satisfied and that underlying tensions remain, waiting for the next crisis. Do you remember how gift-giving required perfect calibration? How letters encoded multiple meanings? Diplomatic conflict resolution demands all those skills simultaneously, plus emotional intelligence, strategic thinking, and the ability to maintain hope and energy through exhausting negotiations where progress is measured in tiny increments. Your head throbs from hours of concentration, your voice is hoarse from careful conversation, and you're not entirely certain whether the compromise you've crafted will hold or collapse within weeks. But for now, there's peace, or at least the absence of open warfare, and that's the best you could achieve. Tomorrow might bring new conflicts, new chances to deploy these skills, and you'll face them because preventing bloodshed through careful etiquette and strategic performance is perhaps the most meaningful work Queenship allows, the place where all those elaborate rules and performances actually serve a purpose beyond mere display. The long day finally ends, and you retreat to your private chambers where the performance can finally soften, though never entirely cease. Your ladies help you out of the day's final gown, carefully removing pins and laces, and you feel the physical relief of shedding the costume that has shaped and constrained your body since dawn. But even here, in what should be the most private space available to you, you're not alone and never truly unobserved. Your most intimate attendants are present, and while they're loyal and discreet, they're still witnesses to these final moments when the gap between public persona and private exhaustion becomes most visible. You sit while your hair is unpinned, and the relief of removing that heavy headdress is almost painful, like blood rushing back into a limb that's been compressed too long. Your scalp aches where pins dug in, and you want to massage it, but that would seem undignified even now. So you sit still while gentle hands work through your hair, brushing out the elaborate arrangement that's been in place for 12 or 14 hours. Your hair, finally loose, becomes one of the few parts of yourself that feels genuinely yours rather than the kingdom's property. And you savour these moments when it flows freely, even though you know that tomorrow morning it will all be bound up again. The bedtime prayers follow their own abbreviated ritual. You kneel beside your bed, not on elaborate cushions like in the chapel, just on bare floor, and recite prayers that have become so automatic you barely register the words à demi-mot. Your ladies kneel nearby, praying with you or simply waiting in respectful silence. and the irony strikes you that even this supposedly intimate conversation between you and God requires an audience. You wonder sometimes whether you've actually prayed sincerely in years, or whether every religious utterance has become performance, indistinguishable from genuine devotion because the two have merged so completely. Historians still argue whether medieval queens experienced their lives as burdensome or privileged, but in this moment of exhausted reflection, you know the answer is somehow both. You've spent the day in luxury most people can't imagine. Fine food, beautiful clothes, comfortable spaces, but you've also spent it imprisoned by expectations, scrutinized in ways that would break most people, performing constantly without any real privacy or authentic self-expression. The privilege and the prison are inseparable, two sides of the same ornate, heavy crown that you're not wearing right now, but can still feel pressing into your skull. Your bed, when you finally lie down, is soft and warm and positioned exactly as you prefer it. But sleep doesn't come immediately because your mind is still racing through the day's events, analysing moments where you might have performed better, worrying about upcoming challenges, planning tomorrow's careful navigation of expectations and protocols. You think about the letters you need to write, the gifts you need to select, the diplomatic conversations you need to have, even in bed, supposedly resting. You're still queening, still calculating, still preparing for the next performance. You think about the other women who've occupied this role, queens before you who navigated these same impossible expectations, who learned these same elaborate dances, who probably lay in their own beds feeling the same mixture of exhaustion and determination. Some of them became legendary for their grace and skill at queenship. Others were remembered as failures. Cautionary tales of women who couldn't master the performance or who tried too hard or not hard enough. You wonder which category you will eventually occupy, whether future generations will study your letters and observe your portraits and judge whether you succeeded at this bizarre, demanding job. The morning awakening ritual that began our journey together will repeat tomorrow, and the day after that, and every day until you die or are no longer queen. The cycle is relentless, and there's no vacation from queenship, no weekend where you can sleep late and be yourself. Even illness doesn't truly excuse you. A sick queen must still perform illness correctly, lying in bed with appropriate weakness but not too much despair, accepting visitors and medical treatments with grace that demonstrates you're bearing suffering nobly. There's literally no escape except death, and even that will be performed, with you trying to die with appropriate piety and memorable final words. But alongside the exhaustion, there's also pride in your competence. You've mastered skills that are genuinely difficult, navigated situations that would confuse and overwhelm someone without your training. You've prevented conflicts, supported your family, managed complex households, represented your kingdom in ways that mattered. The performance may be exhausting, but you've become extraordinarily skilled at it, and there's satisfaction in that mastery, even as you recognize its costs. You're good at being queen, even when being queen feels like being trapped in an elaborate theatrical production that never ends. You think about the small moments of genuine connection, times when you caught the eye of a lady-in-waiting and shared an unspoken understanding, or when a letter from another queen contained a phrase that showed she truly understood your experiences, or when you watched your children laugh and felt genuine maternal joy that wasn't performed for anyone. These moments are rare and precious precisely because they're authentic. Brief windows when you weren't calculating appropriateness but simply being. You collect these moments like jewels, treasuring them as evidence that some part of you still exists beneath all the performance. The rules and rituals that have governed every moment we've explored together, the morning awakening, the dining theatre, the gesture language, the movement protocols, the touch hierarchies, the voice modulation, the gift exchanges, the correspondence codes, the religious performances, the childbearing scrutiny, the mourning scripts, the entertainment boundaries, the travel spectacles, the diplomatic dances. All of these exist not because medieval people were arbitrary or cruel, but because they believed that order, hierarchy, and visible performance of values created stability. Your elaborate queenship was supposed to demonstrate God's order made visible, to show that the world had structure and meaning and proper places for everyone. Whether that justification makes the burden lighter is debatable, but understanding it helps you contextualize your experiences. You're not just playing dress-up or following arbitrary rules, you're embodying a worldview, representing an entire civilization's beliefs about power, gender, divinity, and social order. That's heavy responsibility, and it explains why every tiny gesture matters so much. You're not just a person, you're a symbol, an idea made flesh, walking evidence of how your society believes the world should work. No wonder every movement is scrutinized. You're teaching people what queenship means every time they see you. As sleep finally begins to claim you, your last conscious thoughts might be about tomorrow, another day of performance, another 16 hours of calculating every word and gesture, another cycle of the elaborate rituals that structure your existence. But you'll do it, because you've been trained for it, because people depend on you, because backing down or failing would create chaos worse than the burden of succeeding. You'll wake when they come with candles. You'll submit to the dressing ceremony. You'll glide through your day with perfect posture and modulated voice. And you'll do it all again the next day, and the next. And perhaps, in some small way, there's meaning in that. Not happiness exactly, not freedom, but purpose. You matter. Your actions have consequences. The performance you give affects real outcomes for real people. It's exhausting and often thankless. And the cost to your authentic self is incalculable. But it's also important. Queens who do this job well help maintain peace, support vulnerable subjects, model virtues that ripple through society. Queens who fail or refuse the performance create instability that harms everyone. So you perform because the alternative is worse. And because somewhere beneath all the layers of protocol and costume, you do care about doing the job well. Your breathing deepens and slows. Your body finally begins to relax after the day's sustained tension. The chamber is dark and quiet except for the distant sound of the household settling for the night, servants finishing final tasks, guards changing shifts, the castle exhaling after another day. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, but for now, this moment of rest is yours. You've survived another day of medieval queenship, navigated its impossible demands with skill developed over years of practice, and earned this brief respite before the performance begins again. Sleep comes slowly, gently, like a kind lady-in-waiting drawing soft blankets over your exhausted form. Your mind finally stops racing, stops calculating, stops performing. For these few hours, you're allowed to simply be not a queen, not a symbol, not a performance, just a tired woman in a soft bed, breathing in darkness, dreaming dreams that are yours alone and need satisfy no one's expectations. The hidden etiquette rules that have governed every moment we've explored together finally release their grip, and you drift into the only privacy queenship ever truly allows, the privacy of sleep, where no one can judge your posture or analyze your words or interpret your gestures, where you're finally blessedly free. And so our journey through the hidden world of medieval queenship comes to its close, and you can let all those elaborate rules and exhausting performances drift away into the gentle darkness. You don't need to worry about your posture anymore, or the angle of your hands, or whether your voice has the perfect modulation. You can simply breathe, slowly and deeply, letting the weight of crowns and expectations dissolve like morning mist. The queens we've walked beside, those remarkable women who navigated impossible standards with grace and skill, have returned to history's pages, their stories told, their struggles honoured, You've witnessed their world, understood their burdens, and now you can release it all and sink into soft, welcoming rest. Let the images fade, the candlelit chambers and elaborate gowns, the careful gestures and measured words, the endless performances and constant scrutiny. They're all slipping away, becoming dreamlike and distant, and in their place comes only warmth and comfort, and the deep stillness that precedes true sleep. Your breathing matches the ancient rhythm that all sleepers share, and you're safe and peaceful and free from all demands. The medieval world, with its intricate etiquettes and hidden rules, becomes a story you once heard, interesting but no longer immediate, and you drift deeper into rest where no performances are required and no one is watching. Tomorrow will come with its own gentle pace, but that's far away and need not concern you now. For this moment, there's only comfort and darkness, and the soft surrender to sleep that asks nothing of you except that you rest. The queens we've known would understand this need, would bless this rest, would wish for you the peace they rarely found. And so you sleep, deeply and well, held safe in the knowledge that the performance is over, the story complete, and you're exactly where you should be, drifting in dreams, peaceful and still, finally and completely yourself.